Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets comfortable and science, history and place are allowed to take their time. Tonight, we're easing into a story that doesn't rise upward toward the sky, but instead moves slowly and deliberately downward, into the ground beneath our feet. Not into a cave made for a brief visit, or a tunnel carved for a single purpose, but into a space where thousands of people once lived entire lives without seeing the sun for days, weeks, sometimes longer. Beneath fields, beneath homes, beneath the ordinary surface of daily life, there exists a place called Kaymakli, and it invites us to think differently about shelter, fear, community, and what it truly means to feel safe. Before we begin drifting deeper, take a moment to notice where you are right now. Are you listening from a quiet room, a moving car, a bed slowly growing warmer, or a place that still hums with the day's leftover energy? And what time is it where you are? It feels fitting to ask, because tonight's journey is about life lived without clocks, without windows, without sunrise or sunset to mark the hours. If you find this exploration calming, grounding, or simply a gentle companion while your thoughts begin to slow, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this quiet corner of curiosity reach others who might be looking for a softer way to end their day. Now settle in. Let your breathing find a steady rhythm, and imagine the ground beneath you not as something solid and final, but as the beginning of a story that goes much deeper. At first glance, the land around Kaymakli doesn't seem especially dramatic. Rolling terrain, pale earth, fields that catch the light without much fuss. Nothing about the surface warns you that an entire hidden world waits below. That is part of what makes this place so quietly astonishing. The entrance doesn't announce itself with grandeur. You don't descend through a grand stairway or a ceremonial gate. Instead, the ground simply opens, almost reluctantly, as if revealing a secret it has kept for a very long time. And once you step inside, the light fades quickly, replaced by cool stone walls that feel closer with every step, narrowing your sense of space while expanding your sense of time. Kaymakli is not a single cavern or a straightforward tunnel system. It is a layered settlement carved downward into volcanic rock, spreading out horizontally and vertically in ways that are surprisingly organized. Corridors lead to rooms lead to other corridors, and everything feels intentional. This was not a place shaped by accident or erosion. It was planned, expanded, adjusted, and reused across centuries. What begins as a simple passage soon becomes something more complex, a living structure that once supported daily routines, social rules, work, rest, worship, and survival itself. As you move deeper, it becomes clear that this was not a temporary refuge designed for short-term hiding. Kaymakli was capable of housing thousands of people at once. Families lived here, animals were kept here, food was prepared, stored, and rationed here. Air was circulated through carefully engineered shafts. Water was accessed without exposing the inhabitants to danger above. Life did not pause underground. It adapted. That adaptation didn't happen all at once. The story of Kaymakli stretches across long spans of human history, shaped by shifting threats and changing cultures. While the underground city reached its most developed form during the Byzantine era, evidence suggests that the earliest levels may date back much further, possibly to the time of the Hittites, more than 3,000 years ago. Each generation inherited what was already carved and added what was needed next. Over time, this created a place that feels less like a single construction project and more like a conversation between centuries. To understand why anyone would choose to live beneath the surface, it helps to consider the land itself. Cappadocia's volcanic rock, known as tuff, is relatively soft when freshly exposed but hardens when it meets air. This unusual quality made it possible to carve spaces with basic tools while still ensuring long-term stability. Once hollowed out, the stone could support ceilings, walls, and even multiple levels above, Nature in this case quietly cooperated with human necessity. Yet geology alone does not explain the depth, scale, or complexity of Kaymakli. The real reason lies in fear, persistence, and a very practical understanding of risk. For centuries, the region was vulnerable to raids, invasions, and religious persecution. Armies passed through, power shifted hands. For communities living here, safety was never guaranteed. Instead of building higher walls or stronger fortresses that could be seen from miles away, they chose invisibility. When danger approached, entire populations could disappear into the earth, sealing themselves off from the surface world. This decision shaped every detail of the underground city. Doorways were narrow, forcing anyone entering to move slowly. Large circular stone doors could be rolled into place from the inside, blocking passages with solid slabs that were nearly impossible to break through. These doors were not random obstacles. They were carefully positioned choke points, designed so that a small number of defenders could protect entire sections of the city. If an intruder somehow breached one level, the next could still be sealed. Despite this defensive focus, Kaymakli does not feel like a place built only for fear. There is an unexpected sense of domestic order in its layout. Rooms were designated for specific purposes. Storage areas were kept separate from living spaces. Stables were positioned near ventilation shafts to help remove odours and provide fresh air. Kitchens were arranged so that smoke could be vented discreetly, minimising the risk of detection from above. Every practical problem was met with a solution that balanced survival with the rhythms of ordinary life. Imagine what it must have been like to wake up here. No sunrise creeping through a window, no birds signalling the morning. Instead, the day began when people decided it did. Oil lamps were lit, casting soft, flickering light across stone walls that had witnessed generations before. Footsteps echoed gently through corridors already familiar by touch alone. Voices carried differently in enclosed spaces, becoming softer, closer, more communal. Privacy existed, but it was shaped by proximity rather than distance. Children grew up learning these spaces the way others learn neighbourhoods. They knew which passages sloped downward, which rooms stayed cooler where water could be drawn, and which areas were reserved for adults. Play happened in the same tunnels that once served as escape routes. For them, the underground world was not an emergency shelter. It was home. Time in such an environment behaved differently. Without sunlight to mark the passing hours, life followed internal rhythms. Meals, rest, work, and worship created a shared sense of structure. This kind of time is slower, less fragmented. It doesn't rush forward in sharp increments. It drifts, guided by need rather than schedule. In a place like Kaymakli, patience was not a virtue. It was a necessity. Air, something we rarely think about unless it's missing, was one of the most remarkable achievements of the underground city. Vertical ventilation shafts, some stretching dozens of meters upward, supplied fresh air to even the deepest levels. These shafts were not simple holes. They were carefully calculated to create airflow, drawing stale air out and pulling fresh air in. Some also doubled as wells, providing water while remaining concealed from the surface. Standing near one, you can feel a subtle current against your skin, a reminder that even underground, the city was breathing. What makes Kaymakli especially striking is how interconnected everything was. Nothing existed in isolation. A room was never just a room. It was part of a system that included airflow, movement, defense, and daily routine. The city functioned as a single organism, with each part supporting the others. When danger passed, people could return to the surface, but the underground remained ready, waiting quietly, unchanged. Over time, as threats diminished and life above became more stable, Kaymakli was gradually abandoned. Families moved upward, building homes in the open air. The underground spaces were sealed, forgotten, or repurposed for storage. For centuries, the city rested in darkness, its corridors untouched, its stone doors unmoved. Then, in the modern era, it was rediscovered, not through grand excavation but through curiosity. A wall was broken, a passage revealed itself. The earth began to tell its story again. Walking through Kaymakli today, there is a strange intimacy in knowing that every surface was shaped by human hands. These are not abstract ruins. They are practical, worn, precise. You can see where tools scraped stone, where feet polished floors smooth, where hands once pushed heavy doors into place. The city does not feel frozen in time, it feels paused, as if its inhabitants have only stepped away for a moment. When you stand above Kaymakli, nothing about the surface insists that a vast and carefully engineered world lies below. The land stretches outward in gentle curves, shaped by wind, seasons, and centuries of agriculture. Fields roll softly into one another. Low stone houses rise from pale earth. The sky feels wide, uninterrupted, and ordinary. If you did not know better, you would never suspect that beneath this quiet terrain exists a settlement carved deep into the rock, capable of sheltering thousands. The region surrounding Kaymakli belongs to Cappadocia, an area shaped not by sudden catastrophe alone, but by long geological patience. Millions of years ago, volcanic eruptions from nearby mountains blanketed this landscape in layers of ash and lava. Over time, those materials cooled and compressed into a rock called tuff. Unlike granite or basalt, tuff is relatively soft when first exposed. It yields to tools. It can be carved, shaped, hollowed. Yet once air hardens its surface, it becomes structurally stable, capable of supporting ceilings and walls without collapsing easily. This unusual balance between softness and strength made the ground itself an invitation. To appreciate how remarkable that is, consider how most landscapes resist human intrusion. Hard stone demands heavy force. Loose sand refuses structure. Dense clay can suffocate space. But here, in central Anatolia, the earth presented something different. It allowed itself to be sculpted while still holding firm. Nature did not design Kaymakli, but it provided the material conditions that made such a place possible. The surface of Cappadocia is already famous for its unusual formations. Wind and water carve the volcanic deposits into tall, narrow pillars often called fairy chimneys. Valleys ripple with layered rock faces that look almost folded. From a distance, the terrain can appear soft and almost pliable, as if it were shaped from something closer to compressed dust than stone. Yet that same softness hides structural reliability. What appears fragile is, in fact, quietly dependable. For communities living here thousands of years ago, geography was never an abstract concept. It determined survival. It shaped trade routes, agricultural patterns, and defensive strategies. Cappadocia sits at a crossroads between east and west, north and south. Armies moved through it. Empires claimed it. Borders shifted across it. The openness of the terrain, which today feels expansive and beautiful, once meant exposure. There were few natural barriers to protect settlements from approaching threats. A village built entirely above ground could be seen from far away, and so the very quality that made the region vulnerable above ground made it secure below. Instead of raising walls that could be spotted from a distance, inhabitants turned downward. They allowed the landscape to conceal them. Kaymakli itself rests beneath what now appears to be an ordinary town. Modern homes and roads sit comfortably atop ancient chambers. The idea that daily life unfolds directly above a multi-level underground city feels almost surreal. Children play in streets that float over corridors carved centuries ago. Kitchens prepare meals above storage rooms that once held grain during sieges. The ground is not empty, it is layered. What is striking about this layering is how seamlessly it integrates with the surface. There are no towering monuments marking the entrance, no dramatic cliffs that suggest hidden chambers. The underground city reveals itself only when you step inside. This invisibility was not accidental, it was essential. In times of danger, the ability to vanish mattered more than the ability to intimidate. Imagine approaching this region as an invading force centuries ago. You see farmland, you see modest homes, perhaps you see livestock grazing. What you do not see is where the population might disappear when your presence becomes known. Within hours, entire communities could retreat below ground, sealing entrances behind them. From the outside, the settlement might appear abandoned. The landscape's openness contributed to this strategy. Because there were few natural fortifications, the solution became architectural rather than topographical. Instead of building a castle on a hill, the people of Kaymakli built a city inside the earth. The ground became their fortress. Climate also played a role. Central Anatolia experiences hot summers and cold winters. Underground spaces maintain more stable temperatures throughout the year. Even a few meters below the surface, the air becomes cooler in summer and warmer in winter. This natural insulation made underground living not only defensively practical but physically tolerable. The Earth moderated extremes. Consider how different this is from regions where underground spaces flood easily, or where groundwater makes excavation dangerous. In Kaymakli's case, the volcanic tuff absorbed and drained moisture effectively enough to allow safe construction. Ventilation shafts could be carved without constant collapse. Wells could be dug and protected. The land cooperated just enough to make long-term habitation feasible. Yet geography alone does not explain the scale of what was built. Other regions with soft rock did not necessarily produce multi-level underground cities of this size. The difference lies in the interaction between environment and repeated human need. Cappadocia experienced cycles of instability across centuries. The Hittites, Persians, Romans, Byzantines, Seljuks, and Ottomans all left their mark in one form or another. With each wave of uncertainty, underground spaces expanded. Kaymakli was not created in a single burst of construction. It grew gradually, like a tree extending new branches over time. Early chambers were carved. Later generations deepened them. New corridors connected old rooms. Storage spaces multiplied. Ventilation systems improved. The landscape did not change dramatically during these centuries, but the social and political pressures did. The ground became a long-term solution to recurring danger. Standing above Kaymakli today, it is difficult to sense this history without consciously imagining it. The fields are quiet. The air feels still. Agricultural life continues much as it has for generations. Farmers cultivate the same soil that once concealed entire populations. The invisibility remains effective, though the threat has long since faded. The relationship between surface and subsurface in this region is unusually intimate. In many parts of the world, underground spaces are secondary. They are basements, cellars, mines, or short-term shelters. Here, the underground was once equal to the surface in importance. Life alternated between the two. The boundary was not fixed. This dual existence required trust in the landscape. Carving downward demands confidence that the ceiling will hold, that ventilation will function, that water will not overwhelm the chambers. Over time, that trust must have deepened. Generations grew up knowing that the earth could protect them. It is worth pausing to consider how differently we relate to the ground today. For many of us, the earth beneath our feet is simply foundation. It supports buildings, it anchors infrastructure, but it's not a place we imagine inhabiting extensively. The people of Kaymakli saw it differently. They recognized that the most reliable shelter might not rise above the horizon at all. Geology shaped not only architecture, but also psychology. Living in a landscape defined by volcanic softness likely encouraged experimentation. When stone yields to tools, ideas follow. The act of carving becomes less daunting. One can widen a passage, deepen a chamber, extend a tunnel with relative efficiency. Over decades and centuries, that flexibility accumulates into complexity. Kaymakli is not alone in Cappadocia. Other underground cities, such as Derinkuyu, reveal similar strategies taken even further downward. Together they form a network of subterranean ingenuity that speaks to regional adaptation rather than isolated invention. The landscape did not inspire a single anomaly. It enabled a cultural pattern. Walking across Cappadocia's surface valleys, you may notice small openings in rock faces or faint depressions in the ground. Some lead to storage rooms, others to chapels carved directly into cliffs. The distinction between natural cave and human excavation can blur. This blending of nature and architecture reinforces the sense that the region's identity is inseparable from its geology. Even erosion contributed to concealment. Over centuries, wind reshaped entrances, softened edges, and disguised signs of activity. The landscape quietly repaired its own surface, hiding what lay below. In this way, nature became an accomplice in preservation. Today, visitors descend into Kaymakli with artificial lighting and guided pathways. Safety rails line certain corridors. The experience is curated. Yet beneath these modern adjustments, the fundamental relationship between land and habitation remains visible. You feel how the rock curves inward. You notice how narrow certain sections are. You sense how carefully every meter was used. The town above continues its rhythm, largely unaware of the thousands of footsteps once echoing beneath. That coexistence between present and past feels steady rather than dramatic. The landscape holds both without conflict. As we continue to explore how thousands managed to live below ground for extended periods, it becomes clear that geography was not merely background. It was partner, provider, and shield. The softness of volcanic tuff allowed creation. The openness of terrain demanded concealment. The stability of underground temperature offered comfort. The absence of natural fortresses encouraged innovation. The land hid a city because it could. But it also hid a city because people needed it to. The surface may appear calm and unremarkable, yet beneath it lies proof that landscape is never passive. It listens. It offers possibilities. And sometimes it becomes home in ways that challenge everything we assume about where life belongs. Long before anyone imagined carving rooms, corridors, or entire communities beneath the surface, the ground beneath Kaymakli was being prepared by forces no human would ever witness directly. The story begins not with people, but with fire. Millions of years ago, central Anatolia was far more volatile than the calm fields you would see today. Massive volcanic systems dominated the region. Among them were ancient giants like Mount Erciyes and Hassan Dar, which erupted repeatedly over vast spans of geological time. These eruptions did not simply spill lava across the land. They blasted enormous clouds of ash, pumice, and fragmented rock high into the atmosphere, blanketing the region in thick deposits that would slowly settle and compress. When volcanic ash falls and accumulates in great quantities, it does not remain loose forever. Under pressure and with time, it consolidates into a soft rock known as tuff. That is the material that defines Cappadocia. Unlike dense basalt or granite, tuff can be carved with relative ease using simple tools. Yet once exposed to air and allowed to dry, it becomes firm enough to support weight and structure. This balance between malleability and stability is rare, and it is the quiet foundation of everything that would later unfold beneath Kaymakli. At the time of these eruptions, there were no settlements, no farms, no cities. There were only shifting layers of ash settling into valleys and across plateaus. Each eruption added another blanket. Over thousands and then millions of years, those layers stacked upon one another. Rainfall and wind gradually sculpted them, carving valleys, exposing cliff faces, and shaping what would become the distinctive terrain of Cappadocia. What appears today as an unusual and almost whimsical landscape is in fact the patient result of repeated volcanic violence, followed by equally patient erosion. If you were to slice the land vertically and examine its layers, you would see a record of those ancient eruptions. Bands of lighter and darker tuff mark different phases of deposition. Some layers are thicker and more compact. Others are porous and fragile. This geological layering later influenced how underground spaces could be carved. Builders learned, through observation and experience, which sections of rock were safest to hollow out and which required reinforcement. The fairy chimneys that Cappadocia is famous for were not shaped by human hands. They formed when harder rock caps protected softer layers beneath them from erosion. Over time, the surrounding material wore away, leaving tall, narrow pillars capped with resistant stone. These formations create a landscape that already looks as though it has been carved deliberately, even before any human intervention. The ground itself appears sculpted. That visual softness can be misleading. While tuff is workable, it is not unstable in the way loose sand or gravel might be. Once carved carefully, it can support multiple levels. The compressive strength of dried tuff allows ceilings to span rooms without frequent collapse. This property would later make it possible for underground cities to extend downwards several stories, with rooms branching out horizontally in all directions. Water played a quiet but important role in shaping the region as well. Rainfall and seasonal streams cut into the volcanic deposits, creating valleys that exposed fresh rock faces. These exposures made it easier for early inhabitants to identify suitable carving sites. Where the rock was already revealed by erosion, excavation required less effort. Valleys became natural entry points. The climate of central Anatolia contributed to preservation. It is semi-arid, with relatively low annual rainfall compared to coastal regions. Excessive moisture can weaken certain rock types and cause collapse. In Cappadocia, the moderate dryness helped maintain structural integrity over centuries. Underground chambers did not face constant water infiltration, making long-term habitation feasible. By the time human communities began to settle in this region, the volcanic landscape had long since cooled and stabilized. The eruptions were ancient history. What remained was a terrain both unusual and practical. Early inhabitants would have recognized the carving potential quickly. Even simple dwellings could be hollowed into cliff faces for shelter from weather. Over time, this practice expanded. The earliest known uses of carved rock in the region likely began as surface-level modifications. Shallow rooms, storage niches, animal shelters. Gradually, as communities faced recurring threats, excavation moved deeper. The geological consistency of the tuff allowed for systematic expansion rather than random digging. Builders could predict how the rock would respond to tools. That predictability reduced risk. It is important to understand that the people who carved Kaymakli did not possess modern geological theory. They did not analyze compressive strength with instruments. Instead, they relied on observation passed down across generations. If a ceiling cracked in one section, they learned to avoid that layer elsewhere. If certain veins of rock were too brittle, they adapted their plans. The landscape became a teacher. Volcanic rock also offers thermal advantages. Because it is porous, it acts as an insulator. Underground temperatures remain relatively constant throughout the year, often hovering between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius. In summer, when surface temperatures can become intense, underground chambers stay cool. In winter, they remain comparatively warm. This natural climate control made subterranean living physically tolerable even during extended stays. The texture of tuff matters too. It is soft enough to carve with chisels and basic metal tools, yet cohesive enough to hold fine details. In some underground spaces across Cappadocia, walls were smoothed and even decorated. The rock's workability allowed rooms to be shaped intentionally, rather than left rough and uneven. This contributed to structural efficiency as well as comfort. As settlements expanded, the volcanic terrain influenced not just architecture but also agriculture. The mineral-rich soil derived from volcanic ash proved fertile. Crops grew reliably in the surrounding fields. This agricultural stability supported larger populations, which in turn justified more extensive underground systems. Food production above ground fed those who might retreat below. Trade routes crossing Anatolia added another layer to the story. Cappadocia lay along important connections between regions. Caravans moved through. Cultural influences blended. With trade came wealth, and with wealth came vulnerability. Prosperous communities attract attention. The ability to conceal both people and resources became increasingly valuable. The geological history of Cappadocia therefore set the stage for human adaptation in multiple ways at once. The rock could be carved, the soil could be farmed, the climate allowed preservation, the terrain offered concealment. Each of these factors alone might not have produced something like Kaymakli. Together, they created a rare combination of opportunity and necessity. When you descend into Kaymakli today, you're walking through layers that began as airborne ash. Every wall and corridor owes its existence to those ancient eruptions. The tools that later shaped the chambers followed pathways determined millions of years earlier. Human intention met geological possibility. It is tempting to separate natural history from human history, to treat volcanoes and cities as unrelated chapters. Yet in Cappadocia, the connection is direct. Without the softness of tuff, excavation on this scale would have required enormous labour and time, perhaps beyond what communities under threat could afford. Without structural stability, deep multi-level habitation would have been too dangerous. The rock dictated the limits of imagination. Interestingly, not all layers of tuff in the region are identical. Some sections contain embedded fragments of harder rock. These inclusions can create weak points or obstacles during excavation. Builders likely learned to read the stone visually, identifying subtle colour changes or textures that signalled different properties. The landscape became something to interpret, not just inhabit. The volcanic past also left behind underground water channels in certain areas. While Kaymakli's wells were carved intentionally, the broader hydrogeology of the region influenced where sustainable water sources could be accessed. Digging blindly without understanding groundwater patterns would have been risky. The success of underground cities suggests accumulated knowledge of local conditions. Over time, the repeated act of carving must have changed how inhabitants perceived the land itself. Instead of seeing the earth as a barrier, they saw it as space waiting to be shaped. The boundary between outside and inside blurred. A cliff face was not just a rock wall, it was potential shelter. A valley wall was not just scenery, it was opportunity. This mindset likely extended beyond practical defence. Rock-cut churches and monasteries across Cappadocia demonstrate that spiritual and communal life also embraced excavation. Entire worship spaces were hollowed from stone, complete with carved columns and altars. The volcanic terrain encouraged creativity. Yet even with all these advantages, carving an underground city was not effortless. Removing rock requires time, coordination, and sustained labour. The softness of tuff made the task possible, but not trivial. Excavated material had to be transported away. Structural supports had to be considered. Ventilation had to be planned. The geology provided permission, not completion. As we move deeper into understanding how thousands lived beneath the surface, it becomes clear that the birth of Cappadocia's volcanic landscape was not simply a prelude. It was an active participant. Fire shaped ash. Ash became stone. Stone invited carving. Carving became shelter. Shelter became city. The ground beneath Kaymakli holds within it a memory far older than any human settlement. It remembers eruptions and cooling, compression and erosion, and layered atop that memory is another quieter one. The steady sound of tools against rock, the gradual expansion of chambers, the decision to trust the earth as protection. Geological time and human time intersected here in a way that feels almost seamless. The first tunnels beneath Kaymakli were not dug by a single people at a single moment, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the question so compelling. There is no foundation stone bearing a name, no inscription declaring a beginning, no ceremonial marker to separate the first cut of stone from all that followed. Instead, the earliest tunnels emerged quietly, shaped by hands responding to necessity rather than legacy. To ask who dug them is less about identifying a lone origin, and more about understanding how human behaviour, pressure, and environment aligned over long stretches of time. Archaeological evidence suggests that the deepest roots of underground habitation in this region may extend back more than 3,000 years. Some scholars point to the Hittite Empire, which dominated much of Anatolia during the 2nd millennium BCE, as early contributors. The Hittites were skilled engineers for their time. They worked stone, constructed fortified cities, and understood the defensive value of terrain. While there is no definitive proof that they built Kaymakli as we know it today, there is growing consensus that they likely carved or expanded early subterranean spaces used for storage, refuge, or ritual purposes. These earliest tunnels were probably modest, shallow chambers, narrow passages, spaces designed to be used briefly rather than inhabited continuously. They may have functioned as hiding places during short-term threats or as cool storage areas for food. Over time, as those spaces proved useful, they were expanded. Stone once removed did not need to be removed again. Each generation inherited not only land, but hollowed ground. What matters here is not whether the first tunnel was Hittite or pre-Hittite, but that the idea of going underground entered the cultural memory of the region very early. Once that idea exists, it tends to resurface whenever circumstances demand it. Later civilizations did not invent the concept from nothing. They adapted, refined, and expanded what was already present. After the fall of the Hittite Empire, Anatolia passed through many hands. Phrygians, Persians, Greeks, Romans. Each brought new administrative systems, religious practices, and architectural traditions. Yet beneath these surface changes, the underground spaces remained useful. They did not belong exclusively to one culture. They belonged to whoever needed them. By the time the Roman Empire exerted control over Cappadocia, the region had become a frontier zone, vulnerable to incursions and instability. Roman administration improved roads and cities, but it did not eliminate threats. Local populations still faced raids and unrest. Underground refuges continued to expand, though they remained largely invisible to official records. It was during the early Christian period, particularly under Byzantine rule, that underground cities like Kaymakli reached their most complex and organised forms. Christians in the region faced periods of persecution, especially before Christianity became officially tolerated and later adopted by the Roman state. During these times, underground spaces offered safety. More importantly, they offered secrecy. Yet even here, the story resists simplification. The people who expanded Kaymakli were not only hiding, they were living. The tunnels grew not just as escape routes, but as infrastructure for extended habitation. This shift marks a crucial transformation. Temporary refuge became semi-permanent residence. So who dug the first tunnels? Likely farmers, craftsmen, families. Not soldiers or rulers acting on grand designs, but ordinary people responding to repeated threats. When danger comes often enough, short-term solutions turn into long-term strategies. Digging a shallow refuge once is reactive. Expanding it over generations is adaptive. Tool marks preserved on the walls of Kaymakli offer quiet clues. The marks are consistent with hand tools rather than heavy machinery, which did not exist. Chisels, hammers, and simple picks shaped the stone. This was slow work. It required patience and coordination. Excavation likely occurred incrementally, perhaps during safer seasons, perhaps by rotating groups of workers so daily life above ground could continue. There is also evidence that excavation followed social organisation. The layout of early sections suggests planning rather than random digging. Rooms are positioned in ways that minimise structural risk. Corridors follow gentle curves rather than sharp angles, reducing stress on the rock. This implies accumulated knowledge rather than improvisation. That knowledge would not have been written down in formal manuals. It would have been shared orally, passed from parent to child, From builder to apprentice, the underground city became a repository of lived experience. Mistakes were remembered, successes were repeated. Importantly, digging underground was not an act of desperation alone. It required confidence that the effort would be worthwhile. Carving stone is exhausting. Removing debris is tedious. Creating ventilation and access requires foresight. People would not have invested such effort unless they believed the tunnels would be used again and again. This expectation of recurrence is central. The people who dug the first tunnels did so because they anticipated future danger. Their work was an insurance policy written in stone. That mindset reveals a community accustomed to instability, not panic, but preparedness. Religious factors also played a role as underground spaces expanded. Early Christian communities in Cappadocia carved chapels, meeting rooms, and symbolic spaces into the rock. These were not crude hideouts. They were structured environments designed to support communal identity, even while concealed. Faith shaped space just as much as fear did. It is tempting to imagine a dramatic moment when a group decided collectively to move underground. In reality, the process was almost certainly gradual. A small chamber becomes a cluster connects to another, corridors extend, levels deepen. Over decades, what began as a handful of refugees evolves into a network capable of supporting thousands. Kaymakli's depth and complexity suggest that no single generation completed it. This was a project measured in lifetimes. Some tunnels may have been abandoned or repurposed. Others expanded repeatedly. The underground city is layered not only vertically but temporally. We should also consider that underground excavation did not occur in isolation. Above ground, life continued. Fields were cultivated, homes were built, children were born. The tunnels were part of a broader survival strategy that balanced visibility and invisibility. People did not live permanently underground at all times. They moved between worlds. This movement required discipline. In times of threat, entire communities had to coordinate their descent. Supplies needed to be stored in advance. Animals had to be led into stables below. Entrances sealed. Silence maintained. Such coordination implies social trust and shared understanding. The tunnels were not just physical structures, they were social contracts. Who enforced those contracts? Likely elders, religious leaders, or community heads. Leadership in such contexts tends to be pragmatic rather than ceremonial. Decisions had immediate consequences. A poorly timed descent or ascent could expose everyone. The act of digging itself may have held symbolic meaning over time. Creating space underground was an act of defiance against instability. It said, in effect, that life would continue regardless of external pressure. Stone could be shaped. Darkness could be organized. Fear could be planned for. Interestingly, there is little evidence that the underground cities were designed for expansion into infinite depth. Builders respected geological limits. They stopped where ventilation became inefficient or rock layers became unstable. This restraint speaks to experiential knowledge. The first tunnel diggers learned where to stop as much as where to continue. As centuries passed and threats diminished, digging slowed. The need for expansion lessened. Some sections were sealed, others repurposed. The underground city entered a quieter phase, existing more as an option than a necessity. Yet the identity of those first diggers remains diffuse. They were not remembered by name. Their legacy is structural rather than textual. Their decisions echo through corridors rather than chronicles. In a sense, this anonymity feels appropriate. Kaymakli was never about individual achievement, it was about collective endurance. The first tunnels were acts of care, not conquest. They were shaped by hands that expected no recognition, only safety. When most cities grow, they stretch outward or rise upward. Streets extend, buildings stack higher, walls expand to include new neighbourhoods. Kaymakli followed a different instinct. Instead of reaching for the horizon or the sky, it descended. Layer by layer, room by room, it expanded into the earth. transforming volcanic stone into a structured settlement that functioned with surprising order. What began as a collection of protective spaces gradually became something more deliberate, more architectural, and more permanent. It became a city built downward. The decision to expand vertically into the ground rather than horizontally across it was not simply a matter of available space. Cappadocia had open land. Fields could be cultivated, villages could spread. The limitation was not geography in the usual sense, it was visibility. A larger footprint above ground meant greater exposure. A deeper footprint below ground meant concealment. So growth took a direction that preserved invisibility. Kaymakli ultimately extended several levels beneath the surface. Today, only a portion of those levels are accessible, but archaeological research indicates that at its height, the underground city could descend roughly 8 stories, though not all were continuously inhabited at the same time. The upper levels were typically used for daily activity during periods of refuge, while deeper sections functioned as storage, defensive barriers, or emergency spaces. Descending into Kaymakli is a gradual experience. You do not fall suddenly into vast chambers. Instead, you pass through narrow corridors, duck beneath low ceilings, and feel the air cool slightly as you move downward. This design was intentional. Narrow passages slowed movement. They controlled flow. They forced awareness. In times of threat, such design offered a defensive advantage. In times of peace, it created a sense of intimacy. The layout of the city reflects planning rather than randomness. Rooms are not scattered arbitrarily. They cluster around central corridors that branch and reconnect. Each level serves a distinct set of functions. Upper levels often contained stables and storage areas, while living quarters and communal rooms extended further inward. Deeper sections house specialized spaces such as wineries, kitchens, and chapels. This vertical zoning reveals a sophisticated understanding of weight distribution and structural safety. Carving deeper into volcanic tuff requires attention to load-bearing principles. Builders could not simply hollow out vast caverns without considering what rested above. By leaving thick pillars and curved ceilings, they distributed stress evenly. Many rooms feature rounded or domed shapes, which are structurally stronger than flat ceilings in this type of rock. One of the most remarkable features of Kaymakli's downward expansion is its ventilation system. Vertical shafts extend from the surface to the deepest levels, allowing air to circulate naturally. These shafts were not drilled at the end of construction. They were integrated into the design from early stages. As new levels were carved, shafts were extended accordingly. Some shafts also doubled as wells, ensuring that access to water did not require exposure above ground. Imagine the logistical coordination required to extend a ventilation shaft downward, while simultaneously carving surrounding rooms. Builders had to maintain alignment. They had to ensure that airflow remained effective. They had to prevent debris from blocking channels. All of this was accomplished with simple tools and accumulated knowledge rather than modern engineering instruments. Movement between levels was managed through sloping tunnels rather than vertical ladders. Slopes allowed livestock and elderly residents to move with relative ease. Stairs were rare, likely because carving steps into tuff could weaken structural integrity if done carelessly. Gentle inclines distributed pressure more evenly and reduced the risk of fractures. Defense shaped vertical expansion as much as engineering did. Each level could be sealed independently using large circular stone doors. These doors, carved from solid rock, could be rolled into position from the inside. Once closed, they blocked corridors completely, leaving only small openings for communication or ventilation. If intruders somehow breached one level, defenders could retreat downward and seal off access behind them. The placement of these doors was strategic. They were located at narrow points where corridors constricted naturally. This minimized the size and weight of the doors required while maximizing their effectiveness. The downward layout meant that defenders always had the advantage of gravity. Intruders moving downhill through tight passages faced resistance at every turn. Yet Kaymakli was not only a fortress, it was a functioning community space. The downward expansion accommodated daily routines. Kitchens were carved with smoke ventilation channels leading discreetly to the surface. Storage rooms were positioned where temperature remained stable. Presses for wine or oil were integrated into floors. Even areas designated for worship were carved with care, reflecting social priorities that extended beyond survival. Lighting in a downward city posed obvious challenges. Oil lamps provided illumination, but fuel had to be stored and managed carefully. The design of corridors allowed light to travel as efficiently as possible. Some spaces were intentionally compact, reducing the volume that required illumination. People living here likely developed heightened spatial memory, navigating familiar passages even in dim light. Water access was critical. Wells were carved deep enough to reach groundwater without being detectable from the surface. In some cases, water sources were isolated within the underground city, ensuring that contamination from above could be minimized. The vertical depth of the city provided additional protection for these wells. The deeper levels were not necessarily used constantly. Some may have functioned as emergency reserves. Others likely served as seasonal storage areas. The flexibility of vertical design allowed inhabitants to adapt usage depending on circumstances. In times of brief danger, only upper levels might be occupied. During prolonged threats, deeper sections would become active. Building downward also meant managing excavated material. Carved stone had to be transported upward and disposed of discreetly. This required coordination and effort. Debris could not simply accumulate within the city. It likely became part of surface construction, or was scattered in ways that did not reveal the scale of excavation below. The psychological impact of vertical living cannot be ignored. Descending multiple levels removes you progressively from natural light, fresh air, and the visible horizon. Over time, such separation changes perception. Daily life becomes defined by enclosed spaces and shared proximity. Privacy exists, but it is structured differently than in open-air settlements. Despite these constraints, Kaymakli accommodated large populations during periods of refuge. Estimates suggest that several thousand people could occupy the city at once. This capacity was not achieved through vast open halls, but through efficient distribution of space. Rooms were modest in size, optimized for function rather than grandeur. Vertical design also supported social organization. Families likely occupied designated areas. Communal spaces allowed for coordination and shared activity. The layout reflects hierarchy without overt monumentality. There are no palaces underground. There are no oversized chambers suggesting elite separation. The architecture emphasizes collective endurance. Over centuries, downward expansion followed need rather than ambition. Each additional level represented labor invested in future safety. Builders did not dig for spectacle. They dug for resilience. When threats subsided, digging slowed. When danger returned, excavation resumed. What is particularly striking about Kaymakli's downward city is how stable it has remained. Many sections still stand intact after centuries of abandonment. This durability confirms that vertical expansion was not reckless. It was calculated. The volcanic tuff held because it was respected. Standing in one of the deeper chambers today, you can sense the layered history above you. Several meters of rock separate you from open air. Above that, modern homes and streets continue daily routines. The city built downward now supports a city built upward. Past and present occupy the same coordinates. If you pause for a moment and take a slow breath right now, the air entering your lungs feels unremarkable. It is invisible, effortless, constant. You do not measure it. You do not ration it. You rarely think about where it came from or how it arrived. For the people who sheltered inside Kaymakli, air was never a background assumption. It was a system. It was calculated. It was engineered carefully enough that thousands could descend below the surface and remain there for extended periods without suffocation. To understand how that was possible, You have to imagine removing the sky entirely and replacing it with stone. When a city grows upward, ventilation is easy. Windows open, doors crack, wind passes between buildings. Even in crowded medieval towns, air had ways of circulating. Underground, none of that exists naturally. A sealed chamber carved from volcanic rock does not breathe on its own. Without intervention, oxygen levels would drop quickly, especially with livestock cooking fires and human respiration consuming what little supply exists. The survival of Kaymakli depended on solving that problem from the very beginning. The solution took the form of vertical ventilation shafts, some extending dozens of meters from the deepest levels to the surface. These were not accidental cracks in the rock. They were deliberately carved conduits, aligned with remarkable precision. At the centre of Kaymakli lies a main ventilation shaft estimated to descend roughly 55 to 60 meters. Around it branch smaller shafts feeding secondary corridors and rooms. Together they created a network capable of moving air through multiple levels simultaneously. The physics behind this system relies on a principle that does not require advanced mathematics to understand. Warm air rises, cooler air sinks. By positioning openings at varying heights, the builders of Kaymakli created natural convection currents. As oil lamps and human bodies warmed the air within enclosed chambers, that warmer air would drift upward through shafts, pulling cooler, fresher air downward in its place. The earth itself became part of the mechanism. Unlike a single open chimney, these shafts were integrated into the architecture at multiple points. Rooms were arranged around them, corridors curved toward them. Some spaces widened near ventilation channels, allowing air to disperse before moving deeper into the city. This design suggests foresight. Ventilation was not an afterthought added once rooms felt stuffy. It was foundational. One of the most impressive aspects of the ventilation system is that it also served additional purposes. In several cases, shafts doubled as wells. Water could be accessed without exposing the population above ground. This dual function conserved excavation labour and reduced vulnerability. If an invading force discovered an external water source, the inhabitants below would still have internal access. Maintaining airflow required keeping shafts clear. Debris could not be allowed to accumulate. This likely meant regular inspection and maintenance. Someone had to monitor air quality informally, even if they didn't measure oxygen percentages scientifically. Signs of poor ventilation would have been obvious. Smoke lingering too long, headaches, dizziness. Builders learned through experience how to prevent those outcomes. The placement of stables on upper levels was also connected to airflow strategy. Livestock generate heat and odour. By situating them closer to ventilation shafts near the surface, waste gases could be expelled more efficiently. Human living quarters tended to be positioned slightly deeper, but still within reach of air currents. Kitchens, which produce smoke, were carved with narrow flues that channeled exhaust upward discreetly. These smoke channels were angled in ways that prevented visible plumes from betraying the city's presence. Air management becomes even more complex when you consider population density. Estimates suggest that during times of refuge, Kaymakli could shelter several thousand individuals. Each person consumes oxygen and exhales carbon dioxide continuously. Add to that the respiration of animals and the combustion from cooking fires and oil lamps, and the demand becomes substantial. The ventilation network had to be robust enough to handle peak occupancy, yet it could not be too obvious. Large open shafts visible on the surface would have compromised concealment. Builders likely disguised openings as ordinary wells or integrated them into existing surface structures. Some shafts were narrow enough that they blended into natural depressions in the terrain. Concealment and airflow had to coexist. Temperature regulation intertwined with ventilation. Underground environments remain relatively stable in temperature, but air movement influences comfort significantly. Without circulation, spaces can feel stagnant. The shafts not only supplied oxygen, but moderated humidity and heat distribution. In winter, warmer air rising through the system would create subtle upward currents, reducing dampness. In summer, cooler air descending would prevent overheating. The engineering challenge increases with depth. As you descend further below the surface, the path air must travel lengthens, resistance increases. Without mechanical assistance, airflow weakens. That Kaymakli's deeper levels remained usable indicates that the builders understood how to balance shaft diameter, placement and corridor orientation. Wider shafts improve flow, but require more labour and risk structural weakness. Narrow shafts conserve material but restrict circulation. The chosen dimensions represent compromise and accumulated wisdom. It is important to remember that this system was carved entirely by hand. There were no drills, no powered fans, no reinforced steel linings. Each shaft had to remain aligned vertically, sometimes over great distances. Deviations could reduce efficiency or compromise structural stability. Maintaining vertical orientation likely involves simple but effective tools, such as plumb lines and visual alignment methods passed down through generations. Sound also travelled through these shafts. In a sealed underground environment, echoes behave differently. Voices near ventilation openings could carry upward or downward. This may have been advantageous for communication between levels, but it also required caution during times of hiding. Silence would have been enforced carefully. Another consideration was contamination. Wells connected to ventilation shafts risked exposure to pollutants or deliberate poisoning if discovered. For that reason, some wells within Kaymakli were accessible only from below and did not open directly to the surface. This design protected water supply even if upper levels were compromised. The psychological impact of air circulation cannot be understated. Moving air reduces the sensation of confinement. Even subtle currents remind occupants that the outside world still exists. Without that movement, claustrophobia could intensify. The steady whisper of airflow through shafts likely became part of daily life, a quiet reassurance in the dark. Oil lamps consumed oxygen and produced soot. Over time, soot would accumulate on ceilings and walls, especially near flues. Archaeological examination of certain chambers reveals darkened surfaces consistent with prolonged use. This build-up required periodic cleaning, or at least tolerance. The ventilation system had to accommodate not only the presence of smoke, but its gradual residue. During extended stays underground, managing fire safely was critical. An uncontrolled flame could deplete oxygen rapidly or fill corridors with smoke. Kitchens were therefore positioned strategically, often near ventilation channels. Cooking schedules may have been coordinated to avoid overwhelming the air supply. Community discipline would have been essential. The engineering of survival extended to subtle architectural choices. Ceilings were often curved, which helps air circulate more evenly compared to flat surfaces. Sharp corners can trap stagnant air pockets, but rounded contours encourage flow. This curvature also strengthens structural integrity, showing how airflow and stability were addressed simultaneously. In comparison to another major underground city in the region, Derinkuyu, Kaymakli's ventilation network is slightly less centralised but equally effective. Derinkuyu features a massive central shaft visible from multiple levels, while Kaymakli relies on a more distributed system. Both approaches demonstrate regional mastery of underground airflow management. Living without sky means redefining the boundaries of space. Above ground, the sky functions as an infinite ceiling through which air moves freely. Underground, the ceiling is literal and close. Ventilation shafts became artificial skies, vertical reminders that connection to the surface still existed even if it could not be seen. The builders of Kaymakli did not possess modern knowledge of atmospheric chemistry, yet they understood cause and effect intimately. If too many people gathered in one chamber without airflow, discomfort followed. If smoke lingered, headaches ensued. Trial and error refined design. Over generations, these refinements accumulated into reliability. Air also influenced social structure. Certain rooms would have been more desirable due to proximity to shafts. allocation of space likely considered airflow quality. Elders, children, and animals may have been positioned strategically. This suggests that engineering decisions affected daily social dynamics. As we move forward in understanding life underground, ventilation forms the backbone of all other systems. Without breathable air, food storage becomes irrelevant, worship spaces become unusable, defensive strategies fail. The ability to remain below ground for extended periods depended first on sustaining invisible circulation. In the quiet of these stone corridors, air once moved steadily, carrying the warmth of bodies upward and drawing freshness down in return. It was unseen but constant, shaped by deliberate carving rather than chance. The sky may have been absent, but survival did not depend on seeing it. It depended on knowing how to replace it with stone channels that could mimic its generosity, quietly, reliably, and without drawing attention to what lay hidden beneath the fields above. If air is something we forget until it feels scarce, water is something we think about the moment it's gone. A person can survive without food for weeks, without water, only days. For the people who retreated into Kaymakli, sealing stone doors behind them and cutting themselves off from the visible world, water was not a convenience. It was the dividing line between refuge and trap. A city built downward could not rely on streams, rainfall, or exposed wells. It needed water in the dark. The volcanic landscape of Cappadocia offered both challenge and opportunity. Tuff, the soft volcanic rock that made excavation possible, is porous. Rainwater seeps into it slowly, filtering downward and collecting in underground layers. This permeability allowed groundwater to accumulate beneath the surface in relatively stable aquifers. For communities willing to dig deeply enough, fresh water could be accessed without depending on rivers or lakes that might be monitored or controlled during conflict. Inside Kaymakli, several wells were carved vertically through the rock, some extending dozens of meters. These were not surface wells later connected to tunnels. Many were designed to be accessible only from within the underground city. From above, they would appear absent or indistinguishable from natural depressions. This design prevented hostile forces from locating or poisoning the water supply easily. One of the main wells in Kaymakli descends roughly to the level of the central ventilation shaft. In some sections, the well and the ventilation system intersect structurally, but remain functionally distinct. This overlap reflects efficient planning. Excavating deep vertical shafts required labour and coordination. Combining purposes when possible conserved energy. Drawing water from a deep well underground is physically demanding. Buckets would have been lowered and raised by rope, likely through narrow openings to minimise contamination. The work was repetitive and essential. Water had to be rationed carefully, especially during extended stays below ground when usage increased and replenishment depended entirely on the natural rate of groundwater recharge. Storage added another layer of complexity. Water drawn from wells needed to be kept in containers, suitable for both short-term and longer-term use. Ceramic jars were common throughout Anatolia during the Byzantine period and earlier. Such vessels would have been positioned in cool storage rooms, where evaporation and spoilage were minimized. The stable underground temperature helped preserve water quality. Unlike food, water cannot be stockpiled indefinitely without degradation. Freshness matters. Wells provided ongoing supply, but they required protection. If a shaft became blocked or contaminated, survival would be jeopardized. The builders of Kaymakli therefore designed well openings with narrow throats and protective edges carved from the surrounding stone. These structural details reduce the risk of debris falling in. Consider the scenario of siege. An invading force approaches. The population descends underground, sealing rolling stone doors behind them. Days pass, perhaps weeks. Food reserves diminish slowly, but water must remain reliable. The psychological comfort of knowing that water continues to flow beneath the rock would have been immense. Without that assurance, fear could spread quickly. Water use extended beyond drinking, cooking required it, cleaning required it, Livestock consumed it. Even modest hygiene demanded some allocation. Managing distribution within the underground city required discipline. Community norms likely governed who accessed wells and when. Overuse could not be tolerated. The location of wells within Kaymakli reveals an understanding of risk distribution. Rather than relying on a single water source, multiple wells were carved in different sections. This redundancy ensured that if one area became compromised, others could still function. Diversification is a principle found in many resilient systems, and it appears here in stone. Interestingly, some wells in Cappadocia's underground cities were intentionally left unconnected to the surface. Archaeologists believe that these were dug entirely from below to prevent detection. Such wells would draw water from groundwater tables without creating visible openings above ground. This strategy protected the city during times when enemies might search for external signs of habitation. Water quality underground tends to remain cooler and less exposed to contamination than surface sources. However, stagnant water poses its own risks. Regular movement through drawing and consumption keeps wells fresh. During prolonged occupation, constant use likely maintained circulation. During long periods of abandonment, some wells may have stagnated or partially filled with sediment. Lighting near wells required caution. Oil lamps produce soot and consume oxygen. Positioning them too close to well opening could contaminate water or reduce air quality. Builders therefore designed small recesses in walls to hold lamps safely away from the shaft opening while still providing enough light for drawing water. The acoustics of a deep well in an underground city are unique. Sound travels downward and upward through the vertical shaft. The splash of a bucket, the echo of rope against stone, the faint dripping from porous rock layers would have formed part of daily auditory life. In darkness, such sounds become magnified. The well was not only a source of water, but a focal point of activity. Livestock posed additional considerations. Animals require substantial water intake, especially in confined conditions. Stables in Kaymakli were often positioned on upper levels close to ventilation shafts, reducing strain on water distribution. During extended stays underground, rationing may have prioritized human consumption over livestock, or vice versa depending on circumstances. Waste management intersects with water management as well. Contaminating wells with waste would have been catastrophic. Separate areas were designated for sanitation, positioned away from water sources and connected to smaller drainage channels carved into the rock. The downward slope of certain corridors suggests intentional flow direction for runoff, ensuring that waste moved away from living and water storage areas. Comparisons with other underground settlements such as Derinkuyu reveal similar strategies. Derinkuyu features wells that penetrate multiple levels, some of which were accessible only from certain floors. The pattern indicates a shared regional understanding of water protection. Knowledge travelled across communities. Rainfall above ground replenished groundwater gradually. Because Cappadocia's climate is semi-arid rather than tropical, recharge rates were moderate but steady. Prolonged droughts would have posed challenges, but the volcanic rock's absorptive properties helped store water over time. The underground city relied on these natural cycles even while sealed off from the surface. Water storage jars discovered in excavations vary in size, some large enough to supply families for days. Their placement within carved niches suggests intentional organisation. Storage rooms often cluster near wells but not directly adjacent, reducing the risk of accidental contamination while keeping transport distance manageable. Temperature stability underground prevented rapid evaporation. This advantage allowed water to remain usable longer than it might in hot surface conditions. During summer months, descending into Kaymakli would have provided not only safety but relief from heat. Cool water drawn from deep wells would have felt restorative. There is also evidence of wine production within Kaymakli. Presses carved into floors indicate that grapes harvested above ground were processed below. Wine requires water for cleaning equipment and occasionally for dilution. The presence of presses implies confidence in sustained water availability. Such activities would not occur in a space where water was scarce. Water in the dark carried symbolic weight as well. In Christian communities, water is central to ritual practices such as baptism. Underground chapels in Cappadocia sometimes include small basins. Whether these were used frequently during refuge is uncertain, but the coexistence of water and worship spaces suggests that practical and spiritual life intertwined even below ground. The labour required to dig wells cannot be underestimated. Carving downward through rock for tens of metres demands coordination, patience and trust in structural stability. Excavated material had to be removed upward without compromising secrecy. The depth of some wells indicates long-term investment rather than short-term improvisation. During periods of peace, wells may have been used less intensively, but they remained part of the city's readiness. Maintenance likely continued even when full occupation did not. Clearing sediment, reinforcing edges, checking rope wear. Preparedness meant vigilance. Standing near a well inside Kaymakli today, you sense vertical connection in a place defined by horizontal corridors. The shaft draws your attention upward even though you cannot see the sky. It reminds you that life underground remained dependent on unseen forces above. Rainfall, groundwater flow, seasonal cycles. As we continue to explore daily life beneath the surface, water remains central. Without it, kitchens cannot function, hygiene declines, livestock weaken, morale collapses. The engineering of wells ensured that Kaymakli was not merely a hiding place, but a sustainable environment capable of supporting thousands during uncertain times. In darkness, water becomes both resource and reassurance. The steady creak of rope, the cool weight of a filled vessel, the knowledge that beneath layers of stone fresh supply continues to gather. It allowed the underground city to endure beyond brief emergencies and transform into a structured world where survival was not just possible, but organised carefully around the most fundamental human need. Light shapes how we understand space. It tells us where walls begin and end. It shows us the distance between one person and another. It marks morning and evening without effort. In Kaymakli, light did not enter through glass or shutters. There were no windows carved into open air, no beams of sunlight stretching across floors. Homes beneath the surface existed without direct contact with the sky, and yet they functioned. Families gathered, meals were prepared, children slept, conversations unfolded. Life continued inside rooms that never saw sunrise. The absence of windows changes architecture immediately. Above ground, windows are structural interruptions in a wall. They require reinforcement and compromise insulation. Underground, cutting a window into open air defeats the purpose of concealment. Every opening becomes a vulnerability. So the homes inside Kaymakli were carved as enclosed chambers, often modest in size with low ceilings and thick stone boundaries. Privacy existed, but it was defined by corridor placement rather than by transparent barriers. Entering one of these rooms today, you notice its proportions first. Most chambers are not large, they are practical. Wide enough for sleeping platforms carved directly from the rock, spacious enough to hold storage niches cut into walls, tall enough to stand, though not always comfortably. The dimensions suggest efficiency rather than luxury. Space underground was valuable, not because there was too little rock to carve, but because carving required time and energy. Families likely occupied designated clusters of rooms. Archaeological patterns indicate that certain chambers connect in ways suggesting domestic grouping rather than random excavation. A small room might serve as sleeping quarters. An adjacent niche-lined space might hold food or personal belongings. The layout implies familiarity and routine. Without windows, orientation becomes internal rather than external. You cannot look outside to gauge weather or time of day. You rely on communal signals, the lighting of lamps, the sound of footsteps in corridors, the preparation of meals. In such an environment, social rhythm replaces solar rhythm. Oil lamps provided illumination. These small sources of flame produced a warm but limited glow. Shadows would have dominated the corners of rooms. Surfaces closest to lamps show signs of soot accumulation, evidence of repeated lighting over years. Lamps required maintenance. Oil had to be stored and rationed. Wicks needed replacement. Light underground was never casual. It was deliberate. Ventilation played a critical role in domestic comfort. Rooms positioned near airflow shafts would have felt less stagnant. The builders of Kaymakli understood this. Living spaces often appear in proximity to secondary ventilation channels branching from main shafts. Even without windows, air circulated gently through carved passageways. Temperature stability underground influenced home design as well. Unlike above-ground houses in Cappadocia, which must contend with summer heat and winter frost, subterranean rooms remain relatively constant year-round. This meant that insulation, fireplaces, and heavy structural reinforcements against wind were unnecessary. Walls did not need to be thickened beyond what structural support required. The earth itself insulated every chamber. Sleeping arrangements were integrated into the stone. In some rooms, raised platforms carved directly from the rock likely served as beds. These platforms reduced contact with the colder floor and provided subtle separation between sleeping and living areas. Carving furniture into walls and floors eliminated the need for bulky, movable pieces that would clutter narrow spaces. Storage niches are among the most common features in domestic rooms. These shallow recesses line walls at varying heights, designed to hold pottery, tools, and personal items. In a windowless environment, organization becomes critical. Objects must be placed where they can be found quickly, especially during emergencies when lighting may be minimal. Sound behaved differently in enclosed stone homes. Voices carried more easily along corridors. Conversations were rarely isolated entirely. Privacy in modern terms did not exist. Instead, community awareness replaced it. The absence of windows meant fewer distractions from outside noise but greater connection to interior activity. Cooking likely occurred in designated communal kitchens rather than within every domestic chamber. This reduced smoke accumulation in living areas. Kitchens were carved with ventilation flues positioned carefully to channel smoke upward without revealing presence above ground. Families would have collected food and returned to their rooms, maintaining separation between preparation and rest. Water storage inside homes required care. Ceramic jars placed in niches kept drinking water accessible without constant trips to communal wells. The stable underground temperature helped preserve freshness. Without sunlight entering through windows, algae growth and evaporation were minimized. The psychological experience of living without windows is difficult to recreate fully. Natural light regulates mood and circadian rhythm. In Kaymakli, timekeeping relied on social cues and internal clocks. People likely developed routines anchored in shared activity rather than visible sunrise or sunset. Lamps may have been extinguished simultaneously across sections, signalling rest. Children growing up in such spaces would not perceive the absence of windows as deprivation in the way modern observers might. Familiarity shapes comfort. If early memories form within stone chambers, those chambers become normal. The underground world would feel secure, defined, contained. Decoration within homes was minimal but not non-existent. Some walls appear smoothed deliberately, suggesting attention to finish. In certain underground sites across the region, faint traces of plaster or pigment have been discovered, though Kaymakli's domestic rooms remain largely utilitarian. Practicality dominated aesthetic expression. One advantage of windowless design was defensive consistency. No exterior openings meant fewer weak points. During periods of hiding, even the smallest crack of light escaping to the surface could betray occupancy. Homes underground therefore aligned with the broader goal of invisibility. Comparisons with other underground cities such as Derinkuyu show similar domestic arrangements. Both settlements feature compact living chambers connected by narrow corridors, with carved furniture integrated into stone. The pattern suggests shared architectural knowledge across communities. Lighting conditions influence daily tasks. Fine work such as weaving or tool repair would require positioning near lamp niches. Soot-blackened ceilings above certain areas indicate repeated stationary activity. Shadows likely shaped spatial memory. Residents would learn by feel as much as sight, navigating familiar spaces even in low light. Without windows, weather became distant. Storms above ground could not be seen. Rain might be heard faintly through ventilation shafts. Wind would not rattle shutters because there were none. This separation from environmental cues could feel protective during conflict but isolating during extended stays. Ventilation shafts sometimes allowed thin columns of daylight to filter faintly into upper levels at certain angles. These were not windows in the traditional sense, but vertical glimpses of brightness. The light would be limited, indirect, and shifting. For those near shafts, it might offer reassurance that day still existed above. Domestic life underground required adaptability. If a section became overcrowded or poorly ventilated, families might relocate to adjacent rooms. The modular nature of carved chambers allowed flexibility. Walls could be extended, niches added, floors levelled further. Food storage inside homes complemented communal granaries. Small supplies kept within reach reduced traffic through corridors. This minimised congestion during periods when large populations occupied the city simultaneously. There were no doors in the modern hinged sense within many domestic chambers. Openings were simple cut passages, sometimes narrow enough to imply threshold but not sealed individually. Privacy was social rather than architectural. The heavy rolling stone doors guarded major sections of the city, not individual homes. Imagine sitting in one of these rooms at night, the only light coming from a small oil flame. The walls reflect warmth softly. Beyond the entrance corridor, faint footsteps echo. You cannot look out a window to check the sky. You rely instead on memory of why you are here and trust that above the stone ceiling lies the world waiting. Homes without windows might sound confining, but for those seeking protection, enclosure meant safety. The stone did not betray them. It absorbed sound, it concealed light, it held warmth steady. In times of threat, that mattered more than a view. Food has a way of grounding people, even in the most unfamiliar environments. The smell of bread baking, the sound of grain being crushed, the warmth rising from a shared hearth. These are sensations that connect daily routine to survival and comfort at the same time. In Kaymakli, kitchens were not private corners tucked inside family dwellings. They were carefully planned communal spaces, carved deep into volcanic rock, designed to feed thousands while leaving almost no trace above ground. Cooking underground was not simply about preparing meals, it was about managing smoke, conserving fuel, coordinating labour, and keeping an entire hidden population alive without revealing its presence. Fire is both essential and dangerous in an enclosed environment. It provides heat, allows food to be cooked safely, and offers light. At the same time, it consumes oxygen and produces smoke that can suffocate, disorient, or betray those who rely on it. In a city built downward, kitchens had to solve all of these problems simultaneously. The solution was architectural discipline. Kitchens in Kaymakli were typically positioned on upper underground levels, closer to ventilation shafts but still safely concealed from the surface. This placement reduced the distance smoke needed to travel before dispersing into open air. Rather than allowing smoke to drift randomly through corridors, builders carved narrow flues directly above hearth areas. These channels guided smoke upward in controlled paths, minimizing its spread into living spaces. The flues themselves were not wide. A large opening would increase visibility from above. Instead, they were narrow and angled, forcing smoke to cool and thin as it rose. By the time it reached the surface, it would emerge faintly, often indistinguishable from natural ground vapour or ordinary hearth smoke from surface dwellings. In some cases, smoke exited through multiple dispersed openings, reducing the chance that any single plume would draw attention. Cooking fires were likely kept small and carefully managed. Large open flames would have overwhelmed ventilation systems and depleted oxygen rapidly. Instead, slow-burning hearths produce steady heat with controlled output. Fuel choice mattered. Dried animal dung, wood, and agricultural waste burn differently. Each produces a distinct smoke density and smell. The inhabitants of Kaymakli would have learned through experience which fuels were safest to use underground and when. The presence of bread ovens carved directly into the rock offers insight into daily diet and routine. Bread was a staple across Anatolia for centuries. It is calorie-dense, relatively easy to store as grain, and can be prepared in large batches. Stone ovens carved into walls allowed for efficient baking. Heat retained by volcanic tuff made these ovens particularly effective. Once heated, they remained warm long enough to bake multiple loaves with minimal additional fuel. The smell of bread underground must have been powerful. In an enclosed environment, scents linger. For inhabitants, that smell likely carried reassurance. It signalled continuity. It reminded them that daily life had not stopped simply because the sky was inaccessible. At the same time, strong odours had to be controlled. Persistent smells could travel through ventilation shafts. Kitchens were therefore isolated carefully, with airflow directed upward rather than laterally. Grinding grain was another essential task. Hand mills and stone querns found in underground cities indicate that flour production occurred below ground as well as above. Grinding does not require fire, but it does require space and labour. The rhythmic sound of stone against stone would have echoed softly through corridors. In a silent, hiding environment, even such routine noise had to be considered. Grinding may have been timed during periods when external danger was less immediate. Food preparation underground relied heavily on advanced planning. Grain, dried legumes, salted meat, and preserved fruits would have been stored in designated granaries carved into cooler sections of the city. These storage rooms were often positioned deeper than kitchens, where temperature and humidity remained stable. Food travelled upward to cooking areas, then outward to families. Water access influenced kitchen placement as well. Cooking requires water not only for consumption, but for cleaning tools and vessels. Kitchens were often positioned within reasonable distance of wells or water storage areas, minimising transport through narrow corridors. Carrying water long distances underground is physically demanding and increases spill risk. The organisation of communal kitchens suggests coordinated labour. Not every household cooked independently. Instead, cooking likely occurred in shared spaces with rotating responsibility. Such arrangements reduce fuel consumption and simplify smoke management. They also reinforce social cohesion. Preparing food together fosters communication and mutual reliance. Livestock presence added another layer to kitchen logistics. Animals housed in stables near upper levels provided milk, meat, and labour. Butchering would not have occurred indiscriminately underground due to waste and odour concerns. Certain tasks were likely reserved for moments when surface access was safer. Preserved products could then be stored and consumed below. Oil lamps used for lighting kitchens compounded air management challenges. Flames used for illumination consume oxygen alongside cooking fires. Lamp niches carved into walls allowed light placement without interfering directly with smoke flues. Soot accumulation patterns on ceilings indicate where lamps were positioned regularly. Over time, these marks became part of the stone's memory. The absence of windows meant that kitchens had no natural light. Tasks were performed entirely by artificial illumination. This influenced scheduling. Cooking during daylight above ground would not bring additional light below. Instead, the timing of meals followed internal rhythm rather than solar cues. Lamps burned when needed, regardless of hour. Food smells also carry emotional weight. During prolonged stays underground, anxiety and uncertainty would have been common. The familiar scent of bread or cooked grain may have helped stabilise morale. Kitchens were spaces where fear could briefly recede, replaced by routine. Waste management connected directly to cooking practices. Food scraps could attract pests or contaminate water if not handled carefully. Underground cities required strict separation between preparation areas and waste disposal zones. Organic waste was likely stored temporarily and removed when surface access allowed. In some cases, waste may have been fed to livestock. Archaeological traces suggest that certain underground spaces functioned as wineries or presses. Grapes harvested above ground were processed below, producing wine that could be stored safely in cool conditions. Wine served nutritional, cultural, and possibly ritual roles. Its production underground reinforces the idea that Kaymakli was not merely a bunker, but a functioning economic environment. Comparisons with other underground settlements such as Derinkuyu reveal similar kitchen arrangements. In both cities, hearths are positioned strategically near ventilation, while remaining isolated from sleeping quarters. This consistency suggests shared regional knowledge of underground cooking. Fire safety was paramount. A runaway flame underground could be catastrophic. Kitchens were likely supervised carefully. Children would not have been allowed to play near hearths. Fuel storage areas were probably separated from active cooking spaces to reduce risk. The smell of smoke underground differs from open-air smoke. It clings, it settles, it becomes part of the walls. Over time, the scent would have permeated corridors lightly. Combined with the smell of animals, oil, and stone, the underground city developed its own sensory identity. For inhabitants, that mixture would have felt familiar rather than unpleasant. Bread baking underground also suggests confidence in ventilation reliability. People would not risk prolonged fires if air circulation were uncertain. The continued presence of ovens implies that systems worked consistently enough to allow regular cooking, not just emergency heating. The social role of kitchens extended beyond nourishment. They were places of exchange. Information travelled there. Decisions were discussed. Shared labour created bonds. In confined conditions, communal tasks reduce isolation. Kitchens reveal how life maintained normalcy even when surrounded by stone. Smoke was guided carefully. Fire was controlled. Food was prepared with intention. The absence of sky did not eliminate appetite, routine, or the comfort of warm bread passed from hand to hand. The presence of animals underground may seem at first like a contradiction. Animals need space, air, water, and routine. They produce noise, heat, and waste. Bringing them beneath the surface complicates every system already under strain. And yet, in Kaymakli, animals were not an afterthought or an emergency measure. They were an integrated part of life below ground, tied directly to storage systems, food production, and a quiet economy that functioned without markets, coins, or visible trade routes. To understand why animals were brought underground at all, it helps to think again about duration. Kaymakli was not designed for hiding overnight or even for a few days. The architecture assumes extended occupation, weeks, possibly months. During that time, people needed food that could not all be preserved in advance. Milk spoils quickly, meat requires careful processing. Animals provide renewable resources, and renewable resources reduce dependence on finite stores. If a community expected to remain concealed for long periods, animals became essential. Stables in Kaymakli were typically positioned on the upper underground levels, closer to entrances and ventilation shafts. This placement served several purposes at once. First, animals require more oxygen than stored goods. Keeping them near stronger airflow reduced the risk of suffocation. Second, animals generate heat and odour. Upper levels allowed waste gases to disperse upward more efficiently. Third, animals are harder to move through narrow passages. Positioning stables near access points minimised transport through the deepest corridors. The size of these stables suggests that livestock numbers were limited and carefully chosen. Sheep and goats were well suited to underground refuge. They are relatively small, adaptable, and provide milk, wool, and meat. Larger animals, such as cattle, would have been more difficult to house and feed underground for extended periods. The architecture reflects this practicality. Stall sizes align with small to medium livestock rather than large draft animals. Feeding animals underground required planning. Fodder had to be stored in advance. hay, dried grasses, and grain occupied designated storage rooms carved into cooler sections of the city. These rooms were often positioned near stables to reduce transport distance. The volume of storage space indicates careful calculation. Too little fodder would render animals a liability. Too much would consume valuable space needed for human supplies. Water distribution for animals followed similar logic. Animals require more water than humans by volume. Stables near wells or water storage areas reduce strain on transport. Buckets drawn for livestock would have been heavier and more frequent. Managing this workload likely fell to designated individuals or rotating groups. Waste management becomes critical when animals are involved. Manure accumulation in enclosed spaces poses health risks and odour problems. In Kaymakli, stables appear to have been carved with sloped floors and drainage channels. These channels directed liquid waste away from living areas toward disposal zones or temporary holding pits. Solid waste could be collected and removed when surface access was possible or repurposed as fuel once dried. The presence of animals underground also influenced air quality management. Ventilation shafts near stables were essential. Builders likely learned quickly how many animals could be kept safely without overwhelming airflow systems. This balance would not have been static. During shorter periods of refuge, fewer animals might be brought below. During longer stays, numbers would increase cautiously. Beyond animals themselves, storage formed the backbone of underground survival. Food, tools, fuel, and raw materials had to be organised methodically. Storage rooms in Kaymakli are among its most numerous spaces. They range from small niches carved into walls to larger chambers capable of holding substantial reserves. Grain storage was particularly important. Wheat and barley formed dietary staples across Cappadocia for centuries. When kept dry and cool, grain can last for years. Underground chambers provided ideal conditions. Stable temperatures and limited light reduced spoilage and pest activity. Storage rooms were often carved deeper than kitchens, where heat and moisture were less likely to fluctuate. Large storage jars, many of them ceramic, were placed into floor recesses or wall niches. These containers protected contents from rodents and humidity. Their size suggests communal ownership rather than individual household stores. Grain was likely distributed according to need, reinforcing collective responsibility. Salted and dried foods also played a role. Meat could be preserved through salting and drying, though these processes likely occurred above ground when possible due to ventilation demands. Once prepared, preserved foods were stored below. Dried legumes and fruit supplemented grain-based diets. Fuel storage intersected directly with both cooking and heating. Wood was limited in central Anatolia. Dried animal dung became an important fuel source. Its storage underground required careful drying beforehand. Fuel rooms were separated from living spaces to reduce fire risk and odour. Wine and oil production introduce another economic dimension. Presses carved into floors indicate that agricultural products harvested above ground were processed below. Wine, in particular, benefits from cool, dark storage. Amphorae or large jars would have been stored horizontally or upright in niches, sealed carefully. Wine was not only a drink, it was a preservative, a trade good, and a ritual element. Oil, likely from olives or other local sources depending on period, served as both food and lamp fuel. Its storage required sealed containers to prevent leakage and spoilage. The steady availability of oil was crucial for lighting, especially during extended underground stays. Tools were stored systematically. Farming implements, carving tools, rope, and maintenance equipment needed to be accessible. Underground life increases wear on tools due to constant contact with stone. Maintenance was ongoing. Broken tools could not easily be replaced during refuge. Spare parts and materials were therefore essential. The economy below ground did not operate on exchange in the conventional sense. There were no markets, no visible trade stalls. Instead, it functioned as a managed distribution system. Resources were pooled, labour was coordinated, access was regulated. This kind of economy relies heavily on trust and shared norms. Social roles likely shifted during underground occupation. Some individuals focused on water drawing, others on food preparation, others on animal care. Specialization improves efficiency, especially in confined environments. These roles may have mirrored above-ground occupations or adapted to underground needs. Storage also served a psychological function. Knowing that reserves existed reduced panic. Visible jars of grain, stacks of fodder, and sealed wine vessels represented future security. In darkness, tangible evidence of preparation matters. Archaeological evidence suggests that storage rooms were not all accessed equally. Some were sealed off behind rolling stone doors, implying restricted access. These may have held emergency reserves intended only for prolonged sieges. Controlled access prevents premature depletion. Animals also contributed indirectly to economic stability. Milk could be consumed fresh or processed into cheese, which stores longer. Wool could be used for clothing, bedding, or trade once the surface reopened. Hides could be cured for tools or garments. Animals transformed stored fodder into multiple resources. The soundscape of stables would have been familiar. Hooves shifting on stone, soft bleating, the smell of animals mixing with stone and smoke. For inhabitants, these sounds and scents likely reinforced a sense of normalcy. They were reminders of agricultural life continuing even underground. It is important to note that animals underground were not permanent residents. When danger passed, they would return to surface pastures. Underground stables were temporary extensions of rural life, not replacements. This flexibility allowed the economy below to mirror the economy above as closely as possible. Storage rooms show signs of adaptation over time. Some chambers were expanded, others repurposed. A former storage room might become a living space or vice versa depending on need. The carved environment allowed modification without rebuilding entire structures. Comparisons with other underground cities such as Derinkuyu reveal similar patterns. Stables near upper levels, storage chambers deeper inside, presses integrated into floors. The consistency across sites suggests shared regional strategies rather than isolated experimentation. Economic activity underground did not aim for growth, it aimed for continuity. The goal was not accumulation beyond necessity, but survival with dignity. Excess production had no value if it could not be protected or used. When viewed as a whole, animal storage and economy form a single system. Animals convert stored fodder into renewable resources. Storage buffers uncertainty. Coordinated labour distributes effort. The underground city becomes not just a shelter, but a functioning organism. Survival underground required more than air, water, food, and careful storage. It required meaning. When a community retreats below the surface for protection, daily routines can be preserved through planning and discipline, but something else must anchor them. Faith, ritual, and shared belief systems often provide that anchor. In Kaymakli, as in other underground settlements across Cappadocia, spaces were carved not only for shelter and storage, but for worship. Churches beneath the earth were not decorative additions, they were structural elements of social continuity. The existence of chapels within Kaymakli suggests that underground life was not viewed solely as a temporary emergency state. If the population expected to hide for only a few hours or days, formal worship spaces would have been unnecessary. The carving of churches implies prolonged occupation and a commitment to maintaining religious practice even while concealed. These underground churches are modest in scale compared to grand basilicas above ground, yet they follow recognizable architectural patterns. A simple apse carved into the wall marks the focal point of worship. Benches or raised platforms line the sides. In some cases, faint traces of carved crosses or symbolic shapes can still be seen etched into the tuff. The softness of volcanic stone allowed these features to be shaped with relative precision. Positioning of churches within the underground layout was deliberate. They are typically located deeper than stables and storage rooms, but not at the most inaccessible levels. This placement reflects their importance. Worship required quiet, stable air and a degree of separation from daily noise. At the same time, the space needed to remain reachable by the broader community. Light inside these churches would have come from oil lamps placed in wall niches. The flicker of flame against curved stone surfaces would cast moving shadows, altering perception of space. In the absence of windows, the entire visual environment depended on artificial light. Rituals performed under such conditions would feel intimate and contained. The sense of enclosure may even have intensified communal focus. Early Christian communities in the region, particularly during periods of Roman persecution, sought refuge in underground spaces. While Kaymakli's major expansion occurred during the Byzantine era, the tradition of rock-cut worship spaces predates full imperial acceptance of Christianity. Concealment and devotion often intersected. Worship underground allowed faith to continue without attracting attention. Carving a church into stone requires intention beyond immediate survival. The shape of an apse, the orientation of a small nave, even the smoothing of walls all require additional labour that could have been allocated elsewhere. That effort signals value. The builders believed that communal worship strengthened resilience. Sound behaves differently in carved chambers than in open-air sanctuaries. Stone reflects and amplifies certain tones while absorbing others. Chants, prayers, and readings would echo gently along curved surfaces. Even a small gathering could produce a rich acoustic experience. In darkness, sound becomes more vivid. Collective voices would fill the chamber, reinforcing solidarity. The psychological role of worship in confined environments is significant. When people cannot see the sky or track time easily, ritual creates structure. Regular prayer times anchor the day. Sacred texts, recited or remembered, connect the present to broader narratives. Faith provides continuity with the world above ground, even when physical access is restricted. Some underground churches in Cappadocia, including those in larger complexes like Derinkuyu, feature carved columns and more elaborate designs. Kaymakli's chapels tend to be simpler, reflecting perhaps a more utilitarian approach or different phases of development. Simplicity does not diminish importance, it underscores practicality. Ritual objects such as crosses, small icons or manuscripts may have been stored carefully within niches. Organic materials rarely survive long underground without deliberate preservation, so direct evidence is limited. However, the presence of carved altars suggests that Eucharistic practices were maintained during occupation. The temperature stability of underground spaces benefited worship as well. Candles and oil lamps burn more predictably in environments without wind. Textiles used for ritual purposes would not degrade as rapidly in extreme heat or cold. The underground environment, though dark, was not hostile to sacred practice. It is also possible that underground churches served as meeting places for decision-making. In many early Christian communities, religious and communal leadership overlapped. Discussions about resource allocation, defense strategies, or coordinated emergence from hiding may have occurred in the same spaces used for prayer. The church beneath the earth functioned as both spiritual and social center. Burial practices in underground cities remain less well documented. While Kaymakli does not appear to have served as a primary burial site, some underground complexes in the region include tombs carved into side chambers. The integration of burial and worship reflects theological beliefs about life, death, and resurrection. Even if Kaymakli's churches were not burial chambers, the symbolic association of underground space with both refuge and renewal would not have been lost on inhabitants. The act of carving sacred space underground carries symbolic weight. Christianity often speaks of humility, endurance, and faith under pressure. Worshipping within stone walls rather than grand structures above ground may have reinforced those themes. The absence of windows does not eliminate transcendence, it shifts its focus inward. The orientation of underground churches sometimes mirrors traditional eastward alignment found in above-ground Christian architecture. Determining cardinal direction underground requires knowledge and careful planning. builders likely marked orientation from the surface before carving deeper sections. Maintaining such alignment demonstrates commitment to tradition even in concealment. During prolonged refuge, communal worship may have alleviated fear. Singing together, sharing bread and wine, listening to familiar scripture would restore emotional balance. The underground environment could feel isolating. Ritual reconnected individuals to collective identity. Oil used for lamps in churches had to be managed alongside cooking and general lighting needs. Prioritizing illumination for worship indicates its value within the community. Fuel allocation reflects social priorities. Children growing up in Kaymakli would have experienced religious practice entirely underground during periods of hiding. Their earliest memories of worship may have included stone walls, flickering light, and echoing voices. This normalizes the environment, embedding it within identity. Churches beneath the earth also served as symbols of permanence. While enemies might burn homes or seize crops above ground, the carved chapel endured. Stone preserved form even when circumstances shifted. Faith carved into rock becomes physically enduring. Comparing underground churches across Cappadocia reveals both consistency and variation. Some are richly decorated with frescoes, particularly in monastic complexes. Kaymakli's are more restrained, perhaps reflecting its function primarily as a refuge city rather than a monastic centre. Nevertheless, their presence confirms that spiritual life was inseparable from daily survival. As the Byzantine era progressed and Christianity became state-supported, persecution lessened. Yet underground churches continued to exist. They had become part of regional architectural tradition. Even in safer times, rock-cut worship spaces persisted, suggesting that underground architecture was not solely reactive but culturally integrated. In darkness, rituals likely felt concentrated. The absence of external distraction narrows attention. Flamelight isolates the altar. Voices resonate. Stone absorbs and reflects. The experience becomes immediate rather than expansive. If you were moving through Kaymakli during a time of danger, you would not rely on walls alone to protect you. Walls define space, but they do not stop determined intruders. Defense underground required something more deliberate, something that could transform narrow corridors into barriers strong enough to hold back force without announcing their presence from the surface. That solution took the form of massive circular stone doors, carved from the same volcanic tuff as the surrounding chambers, positioned with care at strategic choke points throughout the city. They were not decorative, they were instruments of survival. The first time you encounter one of these doors inside Kaymakli, its scale becomes immediately clear. The stone disc can stand as tall as a person, and is thick enough to resist repeated impact. A circular hole is carved through its centre, small enough to limit access, but large enough to allow communication or defensive action. The door sits within a recessed groove in the corridor floor and wall, designed so it can be rolled into place quickly from the inside. The choice of a circular design was not aesthetic, it was practical. A round stone is easier to move than a square slab of equal mass. By carving the disc to roll along a carved track, builders reduced the physical effort required to deploy it. One or two individuals could shift it into position without complex machinery. Once in place, gravity and weight did the rest. These doors were positioned at narrow points in corridors for maximum effectiveness. A wide hall would require a larger and heavier barrier, increasing vulnerability. Instead, passages were intentionally constricted near defensive thresholds. An invading group forced to move single file would encounter the door at the worst possible moment. Even if they managed to breach one level, another door awaited deeper inside. Defense underground relied heavily on controlled movement. Kaymakli's corridors often curve rather than extend in straight lines. This curvature reduces visibility and slows unfamiliar travellers. Combined with low ceilings that require intruders to stoop, the architecture favours defenders who know the layout. Rolling stone doors amplify that advantage. The central hole carved through each disc served multiple purposes. It allowed inhabitants to see who stood on the other side. It provided a narrow opening through which a spear or tool could be thrust if necessary. It also permitted airflow to continue even when the door was sealed. Completely blocking ventilation would endanger those seeking refuge. The whole balanced security and survival. Silence was part of the defensive strategy. Above ground, fortifications announced strength through height and visibility. Underground, survival depended on concealment. When a stone door rolled into place, the sound would echo briefly through corridors and then fade. From the surface, nothing would indicate that an entire section of the city had been sealed. No smoke plume, no visible barricade, only stone beneath stone. It's important to understand that these doors were not designed for constant closure. They were emergency measures. During normal underground occupation, passages remained open to allow movement and airflow. The decision to seal a section would be coordinated and deliberate. Once closed, reopening required effort and collective agreement. The weight of each stone disc suggests significant labour in its creation. Carving a circular slab from solid tuff requires careful planning. The disc had to be thick enough to resist fracture, but not so heavy that it could not be moved. The track in which it rolled had to be aligned precisely with the corridor walls to prevent jamming. Some doors in Kaymakli measure over 1 metre in diameter and weigh several hundred kilograms. That they could be manoeuvred without metal hinges or counterweights speaks to the engineering understanding of leverage and balance within the community. The recessed track allowed gravity to assist in final positioning, reducing the force required to hold it closed. Defence underground also included layered sealing. A door might block a main corridor, while secondary doors secured adjacent passages. This segmentation prevented a single breach from exposing the entire city. The design reflects redundancy, a common feature in resilient systems. Psychologically, the presence of these doors must have been reassuring. In times of threat, retreating behind a heavy stone barrier offers tangible protection. You can see it. You can touch it. It separates danger from safety in a way that abstract hope cannot. The act of rolling it into place becomes a ritual of containment. At the same time, stone doors impose confinement. Once sealed, those inside must trust their preparations completely. There is no easy exit if conditions deteriorate. Food and water must last. Air must circulate. Defense in silence requires patience. Comparisons with other underground complexes such as Derinkuyu reveal similar rolling stone mechanisms. The recurrence across sites suggests shared regional knowledge. This was not an isolated invention. It was a common response to recurring threat. The placement of doors also reveals a hierarchy of space. Not every room required individual sealing. Instead, sections were grouped logically. Living quarters might share a defensive threshold with storage rooms and wells, ensuring that essential resources remained protected behind a single barrier. Stone doors were not the only defensive features. Narrow passages, sudden turns and vertical shifts all contributed. But the doors represent the most visible symbol of underground strategy. They convert architecture into action. One might ask how intruders could respond if they discovered such a door. Breaking through solid tuff of that thickness in a confined space would require time and tools. Meanwhile, defenders could respond through the central hole or retreat to deeper levels. The design assumes that speed and familiarity outweigh brute force. The rolling mechanism itself likely required maintenance. Stone can chip, tracks can erode. Regular inspection would be necessary to ensure that doors remained functional. A jammed door during crisis would be catastrophic. The silence mentioned in the title is not accidental. Underground defense depends on minimizing detectable activity. Unlike above-ground fortifications where shouting and visible combat occur, Kaymakli's strategy aimed to avoid confrontation entirely. The goal was not to repel an army in open battle, but to endure until it passed. The effectiveness of such defense relies on concealment first and physical barrier second. If invaders never suspect a city beneath their feet, doors remain unused. If suspicion arises, doors provide last protection. The architecture anticipates both scenarios, living with such mechanisms integrated into daily space shapes perception. Children growing up in Kaymakli would know the weight and purpose of these discs. They would understand when silence mattered. The doors become part of communal memory. As we continue to explore life underground, defence remains intertwined with daily routine. Kitchens and churches functioned within spaces protected by stone. Animals and storage depended on secure corridors. The rolling doors did not define existence, but they framed it. Beyond these barriers lay the uncertainty of the surface world. Behind them, a structured, disciplined community persisted in darkness. The stone did not shout its strength. It held it quietly, ready to move when needed, preserving not only bodies but a way of life carved carefully into volcanic rock and defended not with spectacle, but with weight, planning, and patience. Not every descent into Kaymakli happened in panic, but fear was always somewhere in the background. It lived above ground, in the distance between villages, in the rumours carried by travellers, in the sight of unfamiliar banners on the horizon. The underground city was not carved for comfort alone. It was carved because the world above could turn unpredictable without warning. Yet what is remarkable is not simply that people hid. It is that while fear remained above, life continued below. Imagine the moment word reached a settlement that danger was approaching. Perhaps a neighbouring village had been raided. Perhaps scouts reported movement along a trade route. Decisions would be made quickly. Livestock gathered, food packed, tools secured, families directed toward entrances that, from a distance, appeared unremarkable. One by one, people descended. The last to enter would roll heavy stone doors into place, sealing corridors behind them. Above ground, the landscape might appear abandoned, doors left open, fires extinguished, silence settling over fields. To an outsider, it could seem as though the village had fled entirely. In reality, the population was reorganizing beneath the surface, shifting from visible existence to concealed endurance. Fear above ground was immediate and visible. It carried the possibility of violence, confiscation, or displacement. Life below ground was controlled and structured. Once the descent was complete and entrances sealed, routine resumed. Animals were secured in stables, grain distributed, water drawn, lamps lit. The shift from exposure to enclosure altered emotional tone. Underground, the threat became distant. It was still real, but it was abstract. Stone separated the community from direct confrontation. This physical barrier created psychological distance. The danger was no longer approaching. It was simply something that existed elsewhere. Children would have adapted quickly. For them, the descent might even feel like an adventure at first. Corridors familiar from previous retreats would guide them to designated rooms. They would know where to sit, where to sleep, where to remain quiet if necessary. Fear above becomes routine below when practiced often enough. The adults, however, carried a heavier awareness. They understood what could happen if defences failed. They listened for vibrations, for unusual sounds filtering through ventilation shafts. They monitored supplies with sharper attention. The calm underground was not ignorance, it was vigilance. Daily life underground did not mirror surface life entirely, but it did not abandon it either. Meals were prepared in communal kitchens, bread baked, water rationed. Worship continued in carved chapels. Conversations unfolded in low tones. Even laughter likely found its place, though perhaps subdued. The architecture of Kaymakli supported this psychological transition. Narrow corridors and enclosed rooms created intimacy. Proximity fosters cooperation. In confined spaces, individual fear becomes shared responsibility. Everyone depends on everyone else. Light from oil lamps softened the edges of stone walls. Shadows moved as flames flickered. This shifting illumination may have intensified awareness of space, but also created warmth. In darkness, small sources of light become focal points. Families would gather around them, reducing the sense of isolation. Sound behaved differently underground. Footsteps echoed gently. Voices carried farther than expected. Above-ground noise was replaced by interior rhythm. Grinding grain. Animals shifting in stalls. The faint rush of air through shafts. These consistent sounds reinforced the sense that life persisted despite danger. Food distribution became central to maintaining order. During periods of hiding, consumption had to be measured. Panic can increase appetite, but discipline ensures survival. Community leaders likely oversaw rationing, balancing fairness with necessity. Timekeeping underground required adaptation. Without sunlight streaming through windows, day and night blur. Routine becomes the primary clock. Meals at regular intervals. Prayers scheduled collectively. Periods of rest coordinated. Internal rhythms replace external cues. Fear above ground could last days or weeks. The community below needed to remain patient. The temptation to emerge prematurely would have been strong, especially if silence persisted for extended periods. Decision-making about when to reopen entrances required caution and consensus. The underground city was not only a refuge from violence, but from unpredictability. It created a controlled environment where variables were minimized, airflow managed, water secured, entry points sealed. While the outside world shifted, the interior remained constant. Comparisons with other underground settlements such as Derinkuyu reveal similar strategies. Both cities demonstrate how communities adapted to cycles of instability by building concealed networks capable of sustaining large populations. Fear did not lead to abandonment of homeland. It led to transformation of space. The relationship between fear and preparation becomes clear here. Kaymakli was not carved in response to a single catastrophic event. It expanded because fear recurred. Each generation remembered previous threats and prepared for the next. Over time, fear became integrated into architecture. Yet life below was not defined solely by fear. It was defined by resilience. Children learned skills. Elders shared stories. Worship reinforced identity. Even in concealment, social structures persisted. The presence of animals underground reinforced continuity with surface agriculture. Milk still flowed. Wool still provided warmth. The economy adapted but did not disappear. The community remained intact. Psychologically, descending underground during danger may have felt like stepping into a trusted routine. The first few moments might carry anxiety, but familiarity reduces shock. Knowing where to go, what to do, and how long supplies might last transforms fear into procedure. It is important to recognize that underground refuge was not without stress. Confined spaces can heighten tension. Disputes may arise more easily when privacy is limited. Leadership becomes essential in maintaining cohesion. Ritual, routine, and shared labor mitigate conflict. The stone doors sealed not only corridors but also external uncertainty. Once closed, the focus shifts inward. Survival depends on cooperation rather than confrontation. Fear remains above, unable to penetrate directly. Ventilation shafts allowed faint sounds from the surface to filter downward at times. The distant echo of hooves or voices might reach attentive ears. Such sounds would heighten awareness. Silence above could be reassuring or ominous depending on context. When the moment came to reopen the doors and ascend, relief would mix with caution. The return to sunlight after extended darkness affects the senses sharply. Eyes adjust slowly. Air feels different. The horizon reappears. The cyclical pattern of fear above and life below shaped identity in Cappadocia. Communities learned that survival did not require migration. It required adaptation. They did not abandon fields permanently. They learned to disappear temporarily. In this rhythm, underground existence became part of normal life. It was not exile, it was strategy. The ability to transition smoothly between visible and hidden worlds became cultural knowledge passed across generations. Living alone underground would already require adjustment. Living there with thousands of others demands something far more complex than courage. It demands structure, it demands discipline, it demands habits that prevent friction from turning into fracture. When the people of Kaymakli descended beneath the surface during times of danger, they did not scatter randomly through corridors. They entered a system designed not only to hide them, but to organise them. The remarkable achievement of Kaymakli is not simply that it could shelter thousands, it is that it could hold them together. The physical layout of the underground city reveals the first layer of that organisation. Rooms are not uniform in size, but they are predictable. Corridors connect clusters in logical patterns. Large open halls are rare, replaced instead by interconnected chambers that break population density into manageable segments. This architectural segmentation likely helped prevent overcrowding from becoming overwhelming. Rather than thousands gathering in one cavernous space, they occupied distributed zones, each with its own rhythm. Population estimates for Kaymakli during peak refuge periods often reach several thousand individuals. While exact numbers remain debated, even a conservative estimate suggests a density far greater than most surface villages of the same era. That density could easily produce tension if unmanaged. The underground city's design mitigated this risk by creating defined functional spaces. Living quarters, kitchens, storage rooms, stables, chapels, and work areas. Clear purpose reduces conflict. Families likely remained grouped together in familiar clusters. Multi-room sections connected by short corridors may have housed extended households. Such grouping preserves social continuity. Children remain with parents. Elders remain within known circles. This reduces disorientation during descent and minimises the emotional strain of confinement. Movement patterns underground would have been disciplined. Narrow corridors cannot support chaotic traffic. If two groups attempt to pass simultaneously in opposite directions, congestion forms quickly. This implies informal rules governing direction, timing, and priority. Perhaps certain corridors were designated for specific purposes during occupation. Perhaps elders or designated leaders coordinated traffic flow during peak activity. Lighting also influenced social order. Oil lamps were limited resources. Rooms could not remain illuminated indefinitely without consuming fuel. This likely meant that activity concentrated in specific areas at specific times. Shared light encourages shared space. When lamps were extinguished, rest followed collectively. Noise control becomes essential in confined environments. Even routine sounds echo along stone walls. Grinding grain, tending animals, drawing water, or children playing would all reverberate through corridors. Over time, the community would develop an instinctive awareness of volume. Loud outbursts risk not only internal disturbance, but potential detection through ventilation shafts. Silence became both courtesy and strategy. Conflict resolution in such conditions required careful handling. There is no easy escape from disagreement when walls are solid stone. Leadership structures likely existed, whether formal or informal. Elders, religious figures, or respected heads of families would mediate disputes. Social cohesion becomes survival infrastructure. Food distribution systems reinforced collective identity. Grain stored in communal chambers was not private property during refuge. It became shared resource. Allocation according to need rather than wealth would prevent resentment. Kitchens served multiple families rather than individual households. Shared meals foster cooperation. Water management demanded similar discipline. Wells inside Kaymakli were limited access points. Drawing water required coordination to prevent crowding. Containers were likely assigned or marked to track usage. Misuse could jeopardize everyone. Responsibility therefore carried weight. Children growing up in this environment adapted quickly to spatial constraints. They would learn which corridors were off limits, where animals were housed, and which areas required quiet. Games likely developed that fit within narrow spaces. Play does not disappear in confinement. It adjusts. Work continued underground. Tools required maintenance, clothing needed repair, grain required grinding, animals needed tending. These tasks provided structure to days that otherwise lacked visible sunrise and sunset. Routine prevents stagnation. Sleep arrangements also required negotiation. Carved platforms and modest chambers limited personal space. Privacy in modern terms did not exist. Families might hang cloth partitions or rely on darkness to create separation. The absence of windows meant that night and day felt similar, so rest likely followed communal schedule rather than individual preference. Ventilation shafts carried more than air. They carried faint echoes of life above. The distant rumble of hooves or muffled voices could heighten anxiety or confirm safety. Attentive listeners might station themselves near shafts to monitor subtle vibrations. This informal watch system added another layer of social coordination. The underground city was not occupied continuously for years at a time in most periods. Instead, it served as refuge during episodes of instability. This intermittent occupation shaped how people related to one another below ground. They were not building a new society from scratch. They were preserving an existing one temporarily displaced. Comparisons with other underground settlements such as Derinkuyu show similar population capacities and structural organisation. Both demonstrate that subterranean living was not improvised chaos, but deliberate planning for large-scale refuge. Religious practice supported unity. Worship spaces carved into rock provided moments where community gathered with shared focus. Prayer and ritual reinforce collective identity, especially in uncertain circumstances. The act of singing or reciting together synchronizes breathing and attention, reducing tension. Health management underground pose challenges. Close quarters facilitate the spread of illness. Ventilation mitigated this somewhat, but hygiene required vigilance. Water for washing would be rationed carefully. Waste disposal systems separated sanitation areas from living quarters. Even so, the risk of disease must have been present. Community awareness and rapid isolation of illness likely played roles in maintaining health. The psychological effect of confinement varies among individuals. Some may find enclosed spaces comforting, others feel trapped. Social support becomes critical. Conversation, shared meals, and cooperative tasks reduce isolation. The underground city's segmented layout may have helped individuals retreat briefly to quieter areas when needed, without disconnecting entirely from community. Economic roles likely persisted below ground. Skilled artisans continued small-scale work. Bakers baked. Millers milled. Shepherds tended animals. Even in refuge, identity anchored in occupation remained meaningful. This continuity reduces panic and maintains self-worth. Leadership in such environments must balance authority with empathy. Strict enforcement of rationing and silence may be necessary, but heavy-handed control breeds resentment. Successful communities likely cultivated trust long before dissent. Underground living exposes fractures in social cohesion quickly. Kaymakli's repeated use suggests that its inhabitants managed this balance effectively. Lighting schedules perhaps marked communal time. Lamps lit in kitchens signalled meal preparation. Lamps in chapels indicated worship. Gradual dimming signalled rest. In absence of sunlight, artificial light becomes communal clock. Gender roles and family structures may have influenced spatial organisation. Certain rooms might have been associated with specific activities traditionally performed by women or men. These roles would adapt under confined conditions, but underlying social norms likely persisted. Fear above ground unified rather than divided the population below. Shared threat encourages cooperation. The knowledge that survival depends on collective discipline reduces selfish impulses. This does not eliminate conflict, but it reframes it. The underground city functioned as a pressure chamber of social resilience. Weak bonds would strain, strong bonds would strengthen. Over generations, repeated cycles of descent and return would refine communal habits. Children raised in this rhythm would internalize it as normal. Even leisure may have found space. Storytelling requires no sunlight. Music, even soft singing, travels well in stone corridors. Games that require little space can flourish in confined settings. These activities provide relief from monotony. Emerging back to the surface after extended stays would reshape perception. Open sky feels vast after low ceilings. Sunlight feels intense after lamplight. Yet the memory of underground unity remains. The city below becomes not just refuge, but symbol of shared endurance. As we move forward, attention shifts toward the concept of time in such environments. How did people measure passing days without visible sun? How did they maintain seasonal awareness? Above ground, time announces itself constantly. Light shifts across walls, shadows stretch and shorten. The temperature rises and falls. Birds begin and end their calls. Even without clocks, the body senses progression. Morning feels different from afternoon. Evening carries its own cues. Beneath the surface in Kaymakli, those signals disappeared. Stone replaced sky. Ventilation shafts offered air, but not sunrise. For the thousands who sometimes descended into this underground city, time did not vanish, but it changed character. It became internal rather than visible. It had to be managed deliberately rather than observed casually. When an entire community retreats underground, the first adjustment is sensory. The bright variability of daylight gives way to steady dimness. Oil lamps create small islands of illumination, but their light does not travel far. Without windows, you cannot glance outward to check the hour. The stone walls look the same whether it is dawn or midnight above. In such conditions, the usual cues that regulate circadian rhythm weaken. Human biology is tuned to light. The cycle of wakefulness and sleep responds to changes in brightness. In Kaymakli, prolonged stays underground required substituting environmental cues with social ones. Meals, prayers, work periods, and rest intervals form the structure that sunlight normally provides. Routine became the clock. Imagine descending with your family during a period of threat. The first hours below might feel disorienting. You know the sun is still moving above, but you cannot see it. You rely on memory. Perhaps you entered near midday, perhaps near dusk. Within a short time, that reference fades. Lamps are lit when needed, not because of sunrise. Community leaders likely establish schedules intentionally. Meals at predictable intervals maintain both physical energy and temporal orientation. Communal prayer at set times reinforces shared rhythm. Tasks such as drawing water, grinding grain, or tending animals follow rotation systems. Each activity marks progression, even if the sky remains unseen. In the absence of natural light, sleep patterns can shift unpredictably. Some individuals may struggle to rest without darkness. Others may find it easier, as underground chambers remain consistently dim. Oil lamps would be extinguished in designated sleeping areas to conserve fuel and preserve air quality. The act of extinguishing flame becomes a symbolic end to the day. Ventilation shafts occasionally allowed faint traces of daylight to filter down, but these were limited and indirect. At certain angles, a pale glow might appear near an upper shaft opening, but it would not illuminate living quarters fully. For most inhabitants, light came from oil and nothing else. The stability of underground temperature also affects perception of time. Above ground in Cappadocia, heat builds during the day and dissipates at night. Underground, the temperature remains nearly constant. Without thermal fluctuation, another environmental marker disappears. The body must rely more heavily on social rhythm. Children adapt quickly to new temporal frameworks. If routine dictates that breakfast follows a communal prayer and work begins after that, they accept it. Adults, especially those accustomed to agricultural cycles, may feel the absence of sunlight more sharply. Farmers measure seasons by light length. Underground refuge interrupts that relationship. Seasonal awareness persists indirectly. Ventilation shafts may carry subtle changes in air quality, that hint at weather above. Sound patterns can shift with rain or wind. Even underground, some cues filter through, but these are faint and unreliable compared to open sky observation. Food storage planning required knowledge of how long occupation might last. Estimating duration underground without direct solar observation demanded careful accounting. Community leaders would track days through counted meals, prayer cycles, or simple tallies carved discreetly into stone. There is archaeological evidence in various underground settlements of small marks etched into walls. While not always clearly linked to timekeeping, such marks could represent counting systems. Recording days helps prevent panic and ensures rationing aligns with anticipated duration. Oil consumption itself becomes a time indicator. A certain quantity of oil burns for a predictable number of hours in a lamp. If you know how much oil you have and how quickly it is used, you can approximate elapsed time. This is not precise, but it provides structure. Water distribution may also reflect temporal awareness. Wells are drawn at regular intervals. If animals are fed at consistent times, caretakers track those intervals mentally. Life below ground organises itself around cycles of necessity rather than solar motion. Psychologically, extended darkness can affect mood. Modern studies of prolonged low-light environments show increased disorientation and potential anxiety. In Kaymakli, communal interaction likely mitigated these effects. Shared activity reduces isolation. Sound replaces sight as primary orientation. Worship services carved into underground chapels provided structured intervals. In Christian communities, prayer times traditionally mark morning, midday, and evening. Maintaining these rituals underground anchors temporal awareness even without sunrise or sunset. The repetition of familiar words at expected intervals reinforces continuity. The absence of sky also removes visual confirmation of threat resolution. Above ground, you might look out and see that invaders have departed. Underground, confirmation requires deliberate scouting. Selected individuals would cautiously ascend to surface access points to observe conditions. Their return with news marks significant temporal milestones. Waiting underground changes the experience of time. Anxiety can make hours feel longer. Routine compresses perception. A day structured by predictable tasks passes differently than a day spent in uncertainty. The design of Kaymakli supported activity, reducing idle waiting. Comparisons with larger underground complexes such as Derinkuyu reveal similar adaptations. Both cities feature communal spaces that support organised scheduling. The architecture anticipates prolonged occupancy, which implies planned temporal management. The management of animals underground also reinforces rhythm. Livestock require feeding and watering at regular intervals. Their needs cannot be postponed indefinitely. Animal behaviour provides subtle time cues. Restlessness signals hunger. Quiet periods suggest contentment. Caretakers adjust accordingly. Cooking cycles define days as well. Bread baking may occur once or twice within a 24-hour period depending on rationing. The smell of fresh bread marks progression. Even in darkness, scent becomes a temporal indicator. Lighting discipline prevents exhaustion of resources. Lamps cannot burn continuously in every chamber. Communal rules likely governed when and where lamps were lit. This regulation inherently creates time blocks, work periods with light, rest periods with darkness. Children's sleep patterns might shift if not regulated. Parents would enforce bedtime based on communal agreement rather than sunset. Consistency preserves mental stability. During extended underground occupation, the concept of calendar time becomes abstract. You may not know the exact date. What matters is duration since descent and readiness to ascend. Seasonal agricultural tasks above ground add urgency. Remaining underground too long risks crop failure or missed harvest. Community leaders must balance caution with necessity. Emerging too soon invites danger. Emerging too late jeopardizes economic survival. Decisions depend on scouts' reports and collective judgment rather than visible cues. The architecture itself subtly influences temporal perception. Narrow corridors require slower movement. Low ceilings encourage deliberate posture. The absence of wide vistas reduces spatial expansion. Time in confined environments often feels dense, yet density can also feel protective. Without external distraction, focus sharpens. Tasks are completed methodically. Conversations deepen. Underground time may feel slower but more intentional. When the decision is made to reopen stone doors and ascend, the first encounter with sunlight can be overwhelming. Eyes adjust gradually. The warmth feels different. Sound carries differently in open air. The return reorients circadian rhythm rapidly. Over generations, repeated cycles of descent and ascent likely normalize this temporal flexibility. Communities in Cappadocia learned to operate on dual clocks, one governed by the sun above ground, another governed by routine below. Time without sunlight did not stop. It reorganized. It relied on shared discipline rather than environmental markers. In the absence of windows, people created structure through repetition and cooperation. A child does not measure normality the way an adult does. Normal is whatever surrounds you early enough, often enough, and consistently enough. If you are born in a stone house beneath the surface, if your first steps echo against carved walls rather than across open courtyards, if the light you know comes from oil lamps instead of the sun, then that becomes your baseline. For the children of Kaymakli, underground life during periods of refuge was not an abstract strategy. It was lived experience. We often imagine underground cities as temporary hiding places filled with anxious adults whispering in dim corridors. But if Kaymakli could hold thousands at once, then among them were infants, toddlers, adolescents. Childhood did not pause when the stone doors rolled into place. It adapted just like everything else. The first thing to consider is scale. To an adult, Kaymakli's chambers feel confined. To a child, narrow corridors can feel expansive and mysterious. The sloping passages, the carved niches, the multi-level layout would form a three-dimensional landscape of exploration. Familiarity would replace fear quickly, especially if descent happened more than once during early years. Children learn through repetition. If families retreated underground multiple times across seasons or generations, young members of the community would internalize procedures. They would know which corridor leads to water, which room is for sleeping, where animals are kept. This knowledge provides security. When a child understands space, confinement feels less threatening. Sound becomes especially important in childhood development underground. Echoes in stone corridors amplify footsteps and voices. A parent's call travels farther. The hum of grinding grain, the low murmur of prayer in a carved chapel, the shuffle of animals in stables. These sounds shape sensory memory. Play does not disappear in confined environments. It changes form. Wide-running games give way to quieter activities. Children might invent hide-and-seek games within designated safe corridors. They might trace carved patterns on walls or count niches in storage rooms. Imagination fills gaps left by the absence of open fields. Lighting conditions influence activity. Oil lamps are precious resources, so brightly lit play spaces would be limited. Children would adapt to dim environments, learning to navigate by shadow and memory. The human eye adjusts remarkably well to low light over time. For children raised in this setting, the glow of a single lamp might feel sufficient. Education likely continued underground in informal ways. Skills necessary for survival and daily life are often transmitted through participation. Grinding grain, drawing water, tending animals. Older children would assist adults, learning by doing. Oral storytelling would carry history, values, and practical knowledge across generations. The absence of sunlight affects biological rhythms, but children are adaptable. If community routine establishes clear periods of activity and rest, young bodies adjust. Parents would enforce structured sleep times regardless of external light cues. Consistency reduces confusion. Food availability shapes childhood experience. underground refuge required rationing. Children may have experienced hunger differently during extended stays, yet communal distribution systems aim to protect the vulnerable. In many traditional societies, children receive priority in food allocation. That instinct likely persisted here. Animals underground add another dimension to childhood life. Goats, sheep, or other livestock housed in stables near upper levels would become familiar companions. Children might help feed them, fetch water, or clean stalls under supervision. Caring for animals builds responsibility and routine. Ventilation shafts would fascinate curious minds. The faint current of air moving through a vertical shaft offers a subtle reminder that the world above continues. Children might place hands near the opening, feeling the draft, asking questions about where it leads. Adults would explain carefully, reinforcing caution. Worship spaces carved into stone also influence childhood perception. Participating in prayer or ritual underground creates strong associative memory. The combination of flickering light, echoing voices, and carved symbols forms a distinct sensory experience. Faith becomes intertwined with physical environment. Fear above ground would filter into childhood awareness gradually. Younger children may not grasp political conflict or invasion threats fully. They would sense tension in adult behaviour, whispers, sudden descent procedures, rationing conversations. Yet if parents remain calm and routine remains structured, anxiety can be managed. Social development underground depends heavily on peer interaction. Large population capacity means children are not isolated. They grow up alongside cousins, neighbours and friends. Even in confinement, group play and shared tasks sustain social bonds. Privacy in childhood is minimal underground. Families share close quarters. Personal space is limited. This fosters strong attachment but may also accelerate social maturity. Children learn negotiation early because space demands it. Health considerations are critical. Close living quarters increase risk of illness spread. Parents would monitor symptoms carefully. Isolating sick individuals in designated chambers might be necessary. Children's resilience and vulnerability both play roles here. Comparisons with other underground settlements such as Derinkuyu suggest similar patterns of family clustering and communal resource management. In both cities, architecture supports multi-generational occupation rather than exclusively adult refuge. Psychologically, growing up with periodic descent normalizes dual existence. Above ground is visible life, below ground is protective life. Children learn that both are part of identity. They do not perceive underground as exile, but as extension of home. The tactile environment of stone shapes physical memory, cool walls under fingertips, carved benches serving as beds, narrow steps worn smooth by generations. These textures become familiar anchors in childhood recollection. Education about safety would be constant. Children must understand not to approach sealed doors unnecessarily, not to block ventilation openings, not to waste water. Instruction blends caution with routine. Seasonal cycles above ground influence childhood expectations. Even if underground refuge interrupts agricultural routine temporarily, children observe planting and harvest when on the surface. They connect seasonal memory with underground stories. If descent occurs during winter storms or conflict seasons, children begin to associate certain times of year with transition. Adolescence underground may feel different from early childhood. As awareness of external threats deepens, young people may question the reasons for hiding. Conversations with elders transmit historical context. Stories of past invasions or survival reinforce understanding. Cultural identity strengthens under pressure. Shared experience of descent and return becomes part of communal narrative. Children who grow up hearing stories of ancestors carving tunnels internalize resilience as heritage. Emerging back into sunlight after extended refuge shapes memory strongly. The brightness feels intense. Open space seems vast. Children who have spent weeks underground may run instinctively across fields, reorienting senses. The contrast reinforces awareness of both worlds. The underground city functions almost like a seasonal extension of home. For some children, earliest memories might include descent rituals, carrying small bundles, holding a parent's hand through narrow corridors. Such memories anchor identity deeply. Despite confinement, childhood curiosity persists. Carved niches invite exploration. Multi-level passages offer complexity. If supervised carefully, children would map space mentally with impressive accuracy. In environments where threat above ground recurs across generations, resilience becomes inherited behaviour. Children raised in Kaymakli likely learned not to panic at sudden calls to descend. They learned procedure before fear. Living underground changes the mind long before it changes the body. Stone walls do more than block light and sound. They reshape perception, emotion, and behaviour in subtle ways that accumulate over time. For the people of Kaymakli, retreating beneath the surface was not merely a logistical response to danger, it was a psychological transition into a different mode of being, one where safety depended as much on mental discipline as on architecture. The first psychological shift occurs at the moment of descent. Above ground, danger feels active and external. You can see it approaching, hear it rumoured, sense it in the tension of others. Below ground, danger becomes indirect. It exists somewhere beyond layers of stone, out of sight, but not out of mind. This separation creates a buffer. Fear loses some of its immediacy. It does not disappear, but it becomes something to manage rather than react to. Enclosure has a paradoxical effect on the human mind. In open spaces, uncertainty feels vast. Underground, boundaries are clear. Walls define where you can go. Doors define what is closed. For many people, especially during periods of threat, this clarity provides relief. The environment may be confined, but it is predictable. Predictability reduces anxiety. At the same time, confinement introduces its own stresses. Limited space restricts movement. Privacy is reduced. Sensory variety diminishes. The mind must adapt to monotony. The psychology of the hidden world depends on replacing external stimulation with internal structure. Routine becomes essential. When the environment does not change visibly, internal schedules prevent disorientation. Regular meals, work cycles, prayer times, and rest periods anchor mental stability. Without these, days blur together, increasing stress and irritability. The design of Kaymakli supports routine through spatial organisation. Kitchens, chapels, storage areas, and living quarters are distinct enough to cue different behaviours. Social cohesion plays a central role in underground psychology. Isolation amplifies fear. Community diffuses it. When people share space closely, emotions circulate quickly. Calm spreads. Panic spreads too. Leadership therefore matters greatly. Individuals who project steadiness help stabilize the group. Elders and religious figures likely serve this function, not only through authority but through familiarity. Silence is another psychological tool. Underground defense depends on quiet, but silence also shapes thought. In the absence of constant external noise, internal dialogue becomes louder. For some, this encourages reflection. For others, it can magnify worry. Communal conversation counters this effect. Even quiet speech reassures. The presence of others, heard but not always seen, reduces feelings of isolation. Light scarcity affects mood and cognition. Prolonged low-light environments can alter sleep patterns and emotional regulation. The people of Kaymakli mitigated this through disciplined lamp use. Light was not random, it was purposeful. Lamps illuminated communal spaces at set times, reinforcing rhythm. Darkness signalled rest. This consistency helps maintain psychological balance. Children adapt to low-light environments more easily than adults. Adults carry expectations shaped by above-ground life. They miss the sky consciously. Children accept conditions as given. This difference affects group dynamics. Adults may look to children's adaptability as reassurance, while children absorb emotional cues from adults in return. Memory functions differently underground. Without visual reference points like sun position or changing landscapes, memories anchor to events and routines rather than time of day. A person might remember that something happened after bread was baked, or before the evening prayer, rather than at a specific hour. This event-based memory supports psychological orientation. Fear above ground influences behavior below, but it does not dominate it. The underground environment allows fear to be compartmentalized. Stone doors and sealed corridors create a sense of boundary between threat and daily life. Once closed, attention shifts inward. Tasks become manageable units of focus. This containment of fear prevents emotional overload. Claustrophobia is often assumed to be universal in underground spaces, but it is heavily context-dependent. Claustrophobia arises when confinement feels involuntary and unsafe. In Kaymakli, confinement was chosen as protection. Agency changes perception. Knowing that descent is a strategy, not a trap, reduces panic. Familiarity further softens reaction. Repeated use of the underground city across generations likely reduced psychological shock. Descending was not a rare emergency. It was a practiced response. Ritualizing descent transforms it from chaos into procedure. Procedure reduces fear. Soundscape shapes emotional state underground. The consistent hum of airflow, the muffled movement of others, the occasional animal sound. These become auditory markers of life. Silence, when absolute, might signal danger, but ordinary background sound reassures. The underground city was not silent. It was quietly alive. Smell also influences psychology. Stone carries scent differently than open air. The smell of bread, oil, animals, and damp rock would form a recognizable mixture. Scent is a powerful memory trigger. Familiar smells reassure, especially in darkness. Spatial familiarity reduces anxiety. Knowing where corridors lead, where doors are placed, where safe areas exist gives inhabitants a mental map. Disorientation increases fear. Kaymakli's repeated logical layout supports orientation even in low light. Predictable patterns calm the mind. Conflict resolution underground requires sensitivity. Small disputes can escalate quickly in confined environments. Leaders likely intervened early to prevent division. Social norms emphasizing cooperation would be reinforced during refuge. Survival depends on collective discipline. Faith and belief systems provide psychological scaffolding. Worship spaces carved into stone offered moments of transcendence within confinement. Prayer, chanting, and ritual connect individuals to meaning beyond immediate conditions. This reduces existential anxiety. The hidden world also affects identity. Living underground temporarily shifts self-perception. People become protectors of secrecy. Silence becomes virtue. Patience becomes strength. These traits reinforce communal identity. The group defines itself not by visibility, but by endurance. Time perception shifts significantly. Without sunlight, time feels less segmented. Days may feel longer or shorter depending on activity. Structured routine counteracts temporal distortion. Counting days, tracking resources, and marking events restore temporal sense. Anticipation of return to the surface sustains hope. Underground life is framed as temporary, even if duration is uncertain. The idea of emergence gives purpose to endurance. This forward orientation prevents despair. The moment of ascent carries its own psychological impact. Returning to light after darkness can be overwhelming. Sensory overload occurs, eyes adjust slowly, sound expands, space feels vast. This contrast reinforces appreciation for both environments. Underground safety and surface freedom become complementary experiences. Comparisons with other underground settlements such as Derinkuyu suggest similar psychological adaptations. The repeated emergence of such cities across Cappadocia indicates that underground refuge was not merely architectural ingenuity, but a deeply human psychological strategy. Modern parallels can be seen in submarine crews, cave explorers, or polar researchers who live in confined environments for extended periods. Successful adaptation depends on routine, social cohesion, purpose, and trust. Kaymakli's design anticipates these needs centuries before psychology named them. The hidden world trains patience. When you cannot act directly on external threats, you learn to wait. Waiting becomes active rather than passive. It is filled with tasks, rituals, and care for others. This reframes endurance as participation rather than stagnation. For some, underground life may have induced introspection. Reduced external stimulation encourages reflection. Stories shared in darkness take on greater weight. Memory and imagination fill visual gaps. Oral tradition strengthens. Fear does not vanish underground. It transforms. It becomes quieter, more contained. Instead of sharp spikes of panic, there is a steady awareness of risk managed through preparation. This steady state is psychologically more sustainable than constant alarm. The architecture supports this transformation. Thick walls absorb sound, curved corridors soften echoes, low ceilings encourage deliberate movement. Everything slows slightly. Slowness reduces impulsive behavior. Children raised in this environment absorb these psychological patterns early. They learn that safety sometimes means retreat, that patience is strength, and that community is survival. These lessons persist beyond the underground. For centuries, Kaymakli functioned as a living system. Corridors filled with movement, kitchens produced steady smoke, wells echoed with the sound of rope and water, stone doors rolled into place when danger approached and rolled back when it passed. Then, gradually the rhythm changed. Political landscapes shifted. Threat patterns evolved. Surface settlements became more stable, or at least differently vulnerable. The underground city was used less frequently. Eventually it was left quiet. Abandonment did not mean destruction. That is one of the reasons Kaymakli survived. Unlike wooden structures that rot or stone fortifications that invite dismantling for reuse, the underground city required effort to remove. Its walls were the earth itself. When people stopped descending regularly, entrances narrowed, dust accumulated, and silence settled in. The hidden world did not collapse. It simply waited. The rediscovery of Kaymakli did not occur in a dramatic archaeological expedition with banners and announcements. It began in a far more ordinary way. In the 20th century, residents of the modern village above noticed unusual cavities beneath their homes. While renovating houses or clearing basements, some broke through thin walls of volcanic tuff and found themselves looking into corridors that extended far beyond the expected foundation depth. What had been private storage space suddenly opened into something much larger. This type of accidental rediscovery reflects the nature of Cappadocia's geology. The same soft tuff that allowed ancient builders to carve underground cities also makes it easy for modern construction to intersect with forgotten passages. Beneath contemporary homes, beneath streets and courtyards, the layered past remained intact. When locals first realised the extent of what lay below, the discovery unfolded gradually. A tunnel here, a chamber there, neighbours comparing notes. As more sections were cleared and mapped, the scale became undeniable. What seemed like isolated cavities were part of a coherent multi-level network capable of housing thousands. The transition from hidden refuge to archaeological site changes the psychological meaning of space. For centuries, Kaymakli existed to conceal. Now it was being revealed. The surface found the underground not as threat, but as heritage. Formal archaeological surveys began to document corridors, rooms, ventilation shafts, and rolling stone doors. Researchers measured depth, mapped levels, and analysed structural integrity. Evidence of domestic life, storage niches, ovens, animal stalls, confirmed that this was not a temporary cave system, but a complex urban environment carved deliberately. One of the most striking aspects of rediscovery was preservation. Volcanic tuff is relatively stable when protected from surface weathering. Because Kaymakli remained sealed and undisturbed for long periods, many structural elements survived intact. The rolling stone doors were still in place. Ventilation shafts still connected levels. The architecture remained readable. Comparisons were quickly drawn with other underground cities in the region, particularly Derinkuyu, which had also been rediscovered in the mid-20th century. Together, these sites demonstrated that subterranean urban planning was not isolated but widespread across Cappadocia. The rediscovery of one illuminated the others. As word spread, interest grew beyond local curiosity. Historians, archaeologists, and later tourists began to descend into corridors once reserved for emergency refuge. The purpose of the space shifted fundamentally. Where silence once protected inhabitants from detection, now guided tours carried voices through stone halls. Rediscovery also raised practical questions. How much of the underground city could be made accessible safely? Not all levels are structurally suitable for heavy foot traffic. Some passages remain too narrow or unstable. Preservation requires limiting exposure. Airflow patterns change when thousands of visitors pass through annually. The process of opening Kaymakli to the public required reinforcement in certain areas. Lighting was installed carefully, balancing visibility with preservation. Modern lighting differs significantly from oil lamps. It produces less soot but alters atmosphere. The emotional experience of the space changes when illumination is consistent rather than flickering. For local communities, rediscovery transformed economic patterns. Tourism introduced new forms of livelihood. The hidden refuge became a visible attraction. Shops, guides, and infrastructure developed around entrances. The underground city, once built to avoid attention, now draws it. This transformation raises interesting psychological contrasts. Spaces designed for secrecy become spaces for display. Visitors descend not in fear but in curiosity. Where families once rationed grain and whispered prayers, strangers now take photographs and listen to explanations about ventilation systems and defensive mechanisms. Rediscovery also reconnects contemporary residents with ancestral adaptation. Even if modern villagers are not direct descendants of Kaymakli's original inhabitants, living above such architecture fosters awareness of layered history. The ground beneath one's feet holds more than soil. It holds engineered survival. Archaeological interpretation continues to evolve. Early assumptions about construction periods, population capacity, and primary functions have been refined through ongoing research. Carbon dating, material analysis, and comparative studies with other sites deepen understanding. Rediscovery is not a single moment. It is an ongoing process of interpretation. The preservation of carved churches, kitchens, and storage rooms provides insight into daily life that written records rarely capture. The underground city serves as physical documentation of adaptation under pressure. Its rediscovery expands historical narratives beyond surface monuments and royal inscriptions. Modern safety standards influence which areas remain open. Narrow tunnels that once slowed intruders now challenge visitor comfort. Low ceilings require caution. Ventilation, once entirely natural, must accommodate modern expectations of air quality in confined spaces. There is also the matter of authenticity. Restoration efforts aim to stabilize without altering original character. Replacing damaged sections with modern materials risks distorting historical experience. Preservation teams must balance safety with integrity. The act of walking through Kaymakli today carries a layered awareness. You know it was once a refuge from danger. You know it lay hidden for generations. You know its rediscovery was gradual and accidental. Each corridor becomes both archaeological artifact and psychological space. Rediscovery shifts ownership in subtle ways. What was once exclusively local becomes national heritage and global curiosity. The underground city enters educational curricula, documentaries and travel itineraries. Its meaning expands beyond its original community. Yet even with guided access, much of Kaymakli remains inaccessible. Some levels are closed permanently to protect structural stability. These sealed sections mirror their historical purpose, though for different reasons. Instead of guarding against invaders, they guard against erosion and overexposure. Modern visitors often comment on the ingenuity of ventilation shafts, the weight of rolling stone doors, the complexity of multi-level planning. Rediscovery reframes these features as engineering marvels rather than desperate measures. Context shifts perception. For archaeologists, the underground city offers rare insight into how ordinary people organise space during crisis. Unlike palaces or temples above ground, Kaymakli reflects communal adaptation rather than elite ambition. Rediscovery amplifies voices that history might otherwise overlook. The surface finding the underground is not merely physical excavation, it is reinterpretation. It is acknowledging that beneath visible history lies another layer, sometimes literally. Kaymakli's corridors remind us that survival strategies can be as sophisticated as monumental architecture. Returning to the surface after time spent underground is not simply a physical act. It is a psychological crossing. For the people of Kaymakli, emerging into daylight meant more than opening stone doors and climbing upward through narrow corridors. It meant shifting identity once again, reorienting the senses, and redefining what home meant after living for days or weeks inside the earth itself. The underground city was never intended to replace the surface world permanently. Its purpose was to hold life steady until it could safely continue in the open. And it is in this movement between hidden and visible worlds that Kaymakli offers its deepest lesson. When the decision was finally made to return above ground, it would not have been impulsive. Scouts would move first, cautiously opening access points, listening, observing, testing the air and sound beyond stone. Only when danger was judged to have passed would the larger population follow. The rolling stone doors that once sealed safety would be moved aside again, not with celebration, but with careful restraint. Survival depended on patience even at the moment of release. The first sensation upon emerging would be light. After extended time underground, sunlight does not feel gentle. It feels overwhelming. Eyes struggle to adjust. Colours appear too vivid. The horizon seems impossibly wide after low ceilings and close walls. For adults, this contrast would feel almost disorienting. For children, it might feel exhilarating. Sound behaves differently above ground. Underground, sound is contained, reflected, softened by stone. On the surface, it escapes outward. Wind moves freely. Voices dissipate. Birds call from distances that cannot be traced visually. This sudden openness can feel both liberating and unsettling. Underground life trains the senses inward. Surface life reopens them. Temperature variation also reasserts itself. The stable coolness of volcanic tuff gives way to sun-warmed air, shifting shadows, and the unpredictable changes of weather. Bodies readjust quickly, but the memory of underground stability lingers. People would become more aware of environmental vulnerability again, the very vulnerability that once drove them below, and yet, despite the intensity of return, the surface was where long-term life unfolded. Fields needed tending, animals needed grazing space, homes above ground needed repair after abandonment. The underground city protected life, but it did not produce harvests. It did not offer open air for growth. It was a pause, not an endpoint. This duality is central to understanding what Kaymakli teaches about home. Home is not a single place. It is a relationship between safety and possibility. Above ground offered possibility but not always safety. Below ground offered safety but limited possibility. Survival depended on knowing when to move between the two. The people who built and used Kaymakli did not romanticize underground life. They did not carve it as a preference. They carved it as a response. And yet, over generations, it became familiar, reliable, even trusted. That trust reshaped their definition of home. Home, in this context, was not defined by openness or comfort alone. It was defined by preparedness. A home was somewhere you could return to, even if it was hidden. Somewhere you could rely on when circumstances beyond your control turned hostile. Kaymakli was a backup home, but one designed with as much care as any surface dwelling. Modern conceptions of home often emphasize permanence, a fixed address, a visible structure. Kaymakli challenges that assumption. It suggests that resilience may require flexibility, that a home can exist in layers, that safety does not always align with visibility. The underground city also teaches that home is collective. No single family could have carved, maintained or occupied Kaymakli alone. Its existence depended on shared labour, shared rules, shared discipline. Individual comfort was secondary to communal survival. In that sense, Kaymakli reflects a form of social contract carved into stone. Returning to the surface did not erase that contract. The habits formed underground carried upward. People who had coordinated water use, food distribution and silence below would continue to value cooperation above ground. Crisis shapes culture long after it passes. Children who grew up experiencing descent and return internalized this layered understanding of home early. They learned that safety might require withdrawal, that strength sometimes means patience rather than confrontation. These lessons likely influenced how communities responded to later challenges. Even after underground refuge became less necessary, Kaymakli remained part of collective memory. Its entrances may have been sealed, its corridors quiet, but knowledge of its existence persisted. It was not forgotten. It was stored, much like grain in underground chambers, ready to be used if needed again. This persistence of memory matters. Societies that survive repeated instability do so not by erasing past strategies, but by preserving them quietly. Kaymakli was not dismantled when peace returned. It was left intact. That choice reflects foresight. In modern times, when the underground city was rediscovered, the meaning of home shifted again. The stone corridors no longer served immediate survival needs. Instead, they became historical space, educational space, symbolic space. The function changed, but the lesson remained. Visitors descending into Kaymakli today do so voluntarily, guided by curiosity rather than fear. They experience discomfort not because of danger, but because of unfamiliarity. Low ceilings, narrow passages, dim light. For a moment, modern assumptions about space are challenged. The underground city asks a quiet question. What do you truly need to live? Kaymakli teaches that humans can adapt far beyond what they imagine, but also that adaptation requires intention. Nothing about underground survival was accidental. Ventilation was planned, water secured, food stored, social systems organized. Home, in this sense, is not simply shelter. It is a system that supports life under pressure. There is also a lesson about humility. Above ground, humans dominate landscapes visibly. They build upward, outward, and across. Underground, humans must work within limits. Rock cannot be forced easily. Space must be negotiated. The earth sets boundaries. Kaymakli reflects a relationship with land based on cooperation rather than conquest. The underground city reminds us that invisibility can be power. In a world that often equates strength with visibility, Kaymakli demonstrates the opposite. Survival was achieved by disappearing, not by standing taller. Returning to the light after underground refuge did not diminish the value of darkness. Instead, it recontextualized it. Darkness became associated not with fear, but with protection. Stone corridors became associated not with imprisonment, but with continuity. Modern societies often build defences that are external and confrontational. Walls, surveillance, deterrence. Kaymakli represents a different philosophy. Avoidance over confrontation, endurance over dominance, preparation over reaction. This philosophy has relevance beyond its historical context. In an era of environmental uncertainty, climate instability and social disruption, the idea of layered resilience becomes meaningful again. Kaymakli is not a blueprint to be copied, but a mindset to be understood. Home, ultimately, is not defined solely by where you live when conditions are ideal. It is defined by where you can survive when they are not. Kaymakli was home precisely because it was there when everything else became unsafe. Returning to the surface was always the goal. Life underground was temporary by design. Crops needed sunlight. Communities needed open space. Children needed horizons. The underground city preserved those possibilities by protecting people until they could be realized again. The stone doors did not close forever. They closed when needed and opened when possible. That rhythm, more than the architecture itself, defines Kaymakli's legacy. As we step back and look at the entire story, Kaymakli does not stand as a monument to fear, but to foresight. Not to isolation, but to cooperation. Not to escape, but to continuity. It reminds us that home can exist in unexpected places, that survival often depends on preparation rather than strength, and that sometimes the most profound human achievements are not those that rise toward the sky, but those that quietly carve space within the earth, waiting patiently until it is safe to return to the light.